The slap landed before anyone in the emergency room had time to process what was happening. 1 second, Nurse Mara Elston was standing at the intake desk, hands steady, voice calm. The next, the open palm of Hargrove Medical Center's director, Gerald Fitch, connected with the side of her face hard enough to snap her head to the left. The sound, sharp, flat, unmistakable, cut through the beeping monitors and the low murmur of the waiting room and silenced every single person in the building. Nobody moved. Mara stood perfectly still. Her left hand went to her cheek instinctively, not dramatically, just a reflex, the way you'd check to see if something was broken. Her eyes stayed level. Her breathing didn't change. Around her, 12 nurses, 4 attending physicians, and a full waiting room of patients watched Gerald Fitch straighten his jacket cuffs like he'd just finished signing a document. "Badge. Now," he said. Mara unclipped it from her scrub pocket and set it on the desk. "Security will escort you out. Don't come back." She nodded once and walked toward the exit. Not fast, not slow, just walked. Behind her, nobody said a word. Outside Hargrove Medical Center in the city of Denton Falls, Colorado, the afternoon sky had gone the color of a bruise. Dark gray rolling in from the mountains, the kind of weather that made the air feel heavy before the rain came. Mara Elston stepped through the automatic doors, crossed the parking lot, and sat down on a concrete barrier at the far edge of the lot. She pressed her palm flat against her cheek for 3 seconds. Then she took it away and looked at her hand like she was checking her own work. Across the lot, through the glass doors she'd just walked out of, she could see the intake desk. She could see the staff already moving again, heads down, wheels turning, nobody looking up. She pulled out her phone, stared at the screen without unlocking it. Somewhere behind her in the lot, an old man sat in a wheelchair that a transport volunteer had abandoned near a side entrance. He was watching her, had been since she walked out. His left arm was wrapped in a fresh compression bandage, her work, done 18 minutes ago before everything fell apart. His name was Walter Pruitt. He was 73 years old, a retired military man from somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, and he'd shown up at Hargrove's ER entrance with a wound in his forearm that had already soaked through 2 layers of cloth he'd wrapped around it himself. Nobody at the front desk had moved when he came in. Mara had been the one to get up. Before you go any further, if this story already has your attention, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you want to know how it ends, stay until the last second. 3 hours earlier, the day had been ordinary. Mara Elston had started her shift at 7 a.m., the same as every Tuesday, checking in at the nursing station on Hargrove's ground floor ER with a coffee she'd already half finished in the car. She was 34, medium height, with dark blonde hair she kept in a low bun while working, and a face that people consistently described as difficult to read. Not cold, just contained. The kind of person who could be furious or completely calm, and you'd have trouble telling the difference from across the room. She'd been at Hargrove for 8 months. Before that, a smaller clinic in Glenwood. Before that, a gap in her employment history that she'd listed on her application as personal leave, and nobody had looked at closely enough to question. She was good at her job. Exceptionally good, in ways that were hard to articulate to people who hadn't watched her work. Her assessments were fast and accurate. Her hands didn't shake under pressure. She could recalibrate a plan mid-procedure without losing a step. And she had a habit of catching things. Lab values, pressure readings, subtle color changes in skin that more senior staff missed. What she was not good at was the politics of the place. Hargrove Medical Center was not a well-run hospital. It was a financially successful one, which was a different thing entirely. Gerald Fitch had been director for 6 years, and in that time he'd managed to turn a mid-sized regional hospital into something that looked excellent on paper and felt increasingly hollow in practice. Beds were allocated by insurance tier. Certain attending physicians billed for procedures they supervised from 30 feet away. The ER triage process had been quietly restructured 18 months ago in ways that nobody had officially documented, but everyone understood. Patients with strong coverage moved faster. Patients without it waited. Mara had been watching this for 8 months and keeping her mouth shut because she understood that she was new, and that being new and being right at the same time was a combination that got people fired. She'd managed to hold that understanding until 11:43 that morning. Walter Pruitt had appeared at the ER entrance, Not the main doors, but the side entrance by the ambulance bay that technically wasn't a patient entrance at all. He was on foot, no wheelchair, moving slowly with his right hand clamped over his left forearm. He was wearing a green canvas jacket that was dark at the sleeve. The fabric was saturated. Mara had been crossing the corridor with a supply cart when she saw him through the window. She pushed the cart against the wall and went outside. "Sir." She was already moving toward him. "Let me see that." He looked up. He was a big man, still broad across the shoulders, even at his age, with white hair cut close and eyes that were alert despite the gray tinge around his mouth that told her he was running low. "I got turned around," he said, "was looking for the main entrance." "It's on the other side." "We'll get to that. Let me see the arm." He held it out. She unwrapped the cloth, a torn strip from his jacket lining, she realized, and looked at the wound. Deep laceration, 4 inches, edge of the ulna. The cloth had slowed the bleeding, but hadn't stopped it. The wound needed irrigation and closure, and he needed fluids because based on the pallor and the slight tremor in his extended hand, he'd been losing blood longer than the last hour. "How'd this happen?" she asked, already applying pressure with the clean gauze she'd taken from her scrub pocket. "Fell. Caught a piece of metal fencing on the way down." He said it plainly, no drama in it. "I heal slower than I used to. Walk with me." She brought him inside through the ambulance bay entrance and put him in the closest open bay, Bay 6, which was technically reserved for incoming transports but was currently empty. She hung the call light, snapped on gloves, and started the irrigation. It took her 9 minutes to clean and close the wound. 3 minutes after that, she had an IV line in his right arm and fluids running. She was charting when the charge nurse, Deborah Stills, appeared at the bay curtain with an expression that Mara recognized. She'd been seeing it for 8 months. It was the expression of someone who'd made a calculation. "He's not checked in," Deborah said. "I know, I'm doing it now." "He doesn't have coverage." Mara kept typing. "He has a wound that needed closing 20 minutes ago. The paperwork will catch up." "That's not—" "I know what the protocol says, Deborah." Deborah left. Mara finished the chart entry and checked Walter's pressure. Better, coming up, and asked him if he was in any pain. "Less than before," he said. He was watching her with the same calm alertness he'd had outside. "You work fast." The wound needed it. "Most people would have sent me to admitting first. Most people would have been wrong." She checked the IV rate. "Do you have family in the area? Someone I can call?" "No family. I've got a number I can reach." He paused. "I'll be fine." She nodded and moved to pull the curtain closed, and that was when Gerald Fitch walked into the bay. He was not a physically imposing man, medium height, late 50s, the kind of soft that comes from years behind a desk instead of on a floor. But he had a quality of absolute institutional certainty that he wore like body armor, the unshakable conviction that the building they were standing in existed as an extension of his decisions, and that anyone inside it was subject to those decisions without appeal. He looked at Walter. He looked at the IV. He looked at the chart screen. Then he looked at Mara. "Outside," he said. "I'm with a patient." "Now." She looked at Walter, who gave her a small nod that she interpreted correctly as "go ahead." She stepped outside the bay. Fitch followed and pulled the curtain behind him. "What's the coverage situation on the man in Bay 6?" he said. "He's uninsured. He had an acute wound that required immediate attention. The protocol for uninsured walk-ins involves a financial screening that takes between 20 and 40 minutes. He had an arterial adjacent laceration. I made a clinical call." Fitch's jaw shifted. "You made a unilateral call in violation of—" "I made a call that kept him from needing a transfusion. He's stable now. You can do the financial screening whenever you'd like." The corridor had gotten quiet in the way that places get quiet when people are listening without looking like they're listening. 2 nurses at the station had their heads down over paperwork. A resident near the supply closet was suddenly very interested in his clipboard. Fitch said, "You've been a problem since you got here." "I've been a nurse since I got here." That was the moment she should have stopped. She knew it when she said it, but she'd been holding 8 months of it, and it came out level and clear and completely without hesitation, which she suspected made it worse. Fitch's face went through something she didn't quite catch before it settled into something cold and decided. He stepped closer, not threateningly. He was too controlled for that, but close enough that she could see the exact moment his hand moved. She didn't step back. That was the part that would replay in her head later. Some instinct, trained so deep it had become involuntary, kept her feet flat and her spine straight, and she absorbed the impact of his palm against her left cheek without moving a single inch. The sound was terrible. In the silence that followed, Btch straightened his jacket. Badge. Mara unclipped it and set it on the desk. Security will escort you out. Don't come back. She walked. The rain started while she was sitting on the concrete barrier in the parking lot. Not hard, just a thin, persistent drizzle that turned the asphalt dark and made the mountains in the distance disappear behind a curtain of gray. She was trying to figure out what to feel, not about being fired. That part was, in some detached analytical way, fine. She'd been fired before. She'd been removed from situations before. She understood the mechanics of it. Here one moment, somewhere else the next. You adjust and you move. That part she knew how to handle. What she was stuck on was the moment she'd had in the bay with Walter. The IV running, pressure coming up, 9 minutes to close a wound that would have kept bleeding for another 30 if she'd followed protocol. She was stuck on what Hargrove would call that, a violation, a mistake, a liability, versus what it actually was. And she was stuck on the fact that 12 people had watched Gerald Btch put his hand across her face and nobody had said anything. She'd known what this place was. She'd known for 8 months. She just hadn't expected it to end like this in a parking lot in the rain, with her cheeks still warm. Behind her, she heard the creak of wheelchair wheels on wet pavement. Walter Pruitt had maneuvered himself out of the ambulance bay entrance and across 20 feet of parking lot with one good arm and an IV pole that someone, probably him, had detached from the bay wall and was now using as a rudder. "You shouldn't be out here," she said. "The line's still running." "I capped it." He pulled up beside her. He was still gray around the edges, but steadier than before. He looked at her face. She'd forgotten about the mark. "How bad is it?" "I've had worse." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him directly for the first time since the bay. He was watching her with an expression that was harder to decode than most. Not pity, not sympathy exactly. Something older than both of those things. "It'll fade," she said. He nodded slowly. He reached into the pocket of his canvas jacket with his good hand and pulled out a phone. It was older, a model she didn't recognize, with a military-grade case on it that had clearly taken some real damage over the years. "I'm going to make a call," he said. "You don't have to do that." "It's not for you." He said it simply, without offense. "I've been trying to reach someone anyway. This seems like a good moment." She watched him dial with his thumb and hold the phone to his ear. He waited. Someone picked up. Walter said 2 sentences. She caught a name, a rank, and the name of the hospital, and then he listened for a while and said yes, and ended the call. He set the phone on his knee. "You need anything?" he asked her. "I'm fine." "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." He made a sound that might have been a laugh, short, dry, not unkind. The rain was coming down a little harder now, and water was beating on the compression bandage on his arm. She reached over without thinking and adjusted the edge of his jacket to cover it better. He watched her do it. "How long were you in?" he asked. She went still. Not dramatically. Just still, the way she'd been when Btch's palm hit her. That same trained quality of absorbing impact without reacting to it. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "The way you moved in that bay. The irrigation sequence, the IV placement." He paused. "The way you're sitting right now." She didn't answer. He didn't push it. He just sat with her in the rain, his bad arm in his lap, the phone balanced on his knee, watching the entrance to the hospital with patient, unhurried eyes. 13 minutes passed. Then the sound started, a low, rhythmic percussion that she felt in her sternum before she heard it properly. Her head came up. Her eyes went to the sky above the parking structure to the north, where the gray clouds were moving. The helicopter came in low and fast from the west, cleared the edge of the parking structure by what looked like 30 feet, and set down in the middle of the Hargrove Medical Center emergency lot, with a precision that spoke of someone who'd landed in worse places than this. It was a military transport. Black. The markings on the tail were not civilian. The rotors were still decelerating when the side door opened. 3 people came out. Two were in uniform, one a young specialist who stayed near the aircraft, one who walked with the posture of someone accustomed to entering rooms that went quiet when he arrived. He was in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered, with a face that had been outdoors for most of its life, and a uniform that bore enough commendations to make the attending physicians who'd gathered at the ER windows visibly uncertain about what they were seeing. The third person was a woman in civilian clothes, dark jacket, close-cropped hair, who carried a tablet and was already on a call. The man in uniform crossed the parking lot in a straight line toward the ER entrance and did not slow down. Inside, through the glass, Mara could see the lobby freeze, could see Gerald Btch appear from the administrative corridor, his expression shifting from irritation to something more careful as the automatic doors opened and the officer walked in. Walter Pruitt watched this without expression. "You knew he was coming," Mara said. "I suspected." "Who is he?" Walter looked at her sideways. "Someone who's been trying to find you." Mara's attention stayed on the entrance. Through the glass, she could see the officer speaking to a nurse at the desk. The nurse pointed. The officer looked toward the exit doors, then at the nurse again, and the nurse said something that made his expression go flat and hard, in a way that was visible even from 60 feet away through rain-streaked glass. He turned and came back out through the automatic doors. He crossed the lot toward them without hesitation, like he'd known exactly where to look. The rain didn't seem to register with him. He stopped 6 feet away, looked at Walter. A look that contained a full exchange, efficient as a radio burst. And then he looked at Mara. "Elston," he said. Not a question. She stood up from the concrete barrier. Old reflex. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Dane Rafferty," he said. "Naval Special Operations. Are you all right?" She looked at him for a moment. The question, the way he asked it, direct, no decoration, no preamble, was so different from every human interaction she'd had in the last 40 minutes that it took her half a second to process it. "Yes?" she said. Rafferty nodded. He looked at her cheek. Something moved through his expression and was gone. "They told me inside you were terminated." "About 20 minutes ago, yes." "For treating a patient." "For treating a patient who wasn't pre-approved." Rafferty looked at Walter again, and this time something passed between them that Mara couldn't read. Something with history in it and weight. "I need to go back inside," Rafferty said. He looked at Mara. "I'd like you with me." "I don't have a badge anymore." "You won't need one." She studied him for a moment. The rain was coming down steadily now, soaking through her scrubs, and she hadn't moved to cover herself from it because somewhere in the last 20 minutes she'd stopped noticing it. She looked at the hospital entrance, at the faces she could see through the glass. Staff gathered, watching, not sure what they were about to be part of. She thought about 9 minutes and a clean compression. She thought about a wound that would have kept bleeding. She thought about 12 people who hadn't said anything. "All right," she said. Rafferty turned and walked toward the entrance. Mara fell in beside him. Behind them, she heard Walter Pruitt begin maneuvering his wheelchair back across the lot, and she didn't look back because she understood, in some way she couldn't have fully articulated, that he didn't need her to. The automatic doors opened. The lobby went silent. Gerald Btch was standing at the edge of the administrative corridor, flanked by 2 members of the hospital's security staff and a woman Mara recognized as the head of HR. His expression was the carefully composed version of the face he wore when he wanted to appear reasonable. He had already prepared something to say. She could see it in the set of his jaw. Rafferty didn't give him the opening. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Dane Rafferty, Naval Special Operations Command." His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. "I'm here regarding the treatment and subsequent discharge of a veteran in your emergency room and the circumstances surrounding the termination of the nurse who provided that treatment." He looked around the lobby, not slowly, just completely, the way someone looks when they want to make it clear they're noting everything. "I'm going to need a room, access to your administrative records for the past 24 hours, and I'm going to need everyone who is present in this ER between 11 a.m. and noon today to remain available." Btch said, "I don't think you understand the hospital's position on—" "I understand it fine," Rafferty said. "I'd like to hear yours before I decide what comes next. That offer expires in about 30 seconds. The silence that followed was different from the silence after the slap. That silence had been shock. This one was something else. The kind that happens when a room full of people realizes the landscape has shifted under their feet and they haven't figured out which direction is downhill yet. Mara stood beside Rafferty and felt the mark on her cheek and looked at Gerald Fitch and waited. Fitch said something to the HR director in a low voice. She nodded and walked away toward the administrative wing. "We can use the conference room," Fitch said, his voice recalibrated to something smoother. "This way." Rafferty didn't move immediately. He looked at Mara. "You okay to do this?" he said, quietly enough that it was just for her. She thought about Walter in the bay, about the sound of the drip counter, about her own hands, steady at the instruments, doing the things she knew how to do. "Yes," she said. They followed Fitch down the corridor. Behind them in the lobby, no one moved. No one went back to work. They stood in ones and twos near the nursing station and the intake desk and the waiting room chairs, watching the corridor where the director and a Navy commander and the nurse, who'd been fired an hour ago, had just disappeared around a corner. And in the silence they left behind, a charge nurse named Deborah Stills picked up her phone, looked at it for a long moment, and set it down without unlocking it. Then she picked it up again. She pulled up her contacts. She scrolled to a name she hadn't called in 4 months, a colleague who'd left the hospital under circumstances that everyone had been told not to discuss, and her thumb hovered over the screen. The conference room door, visible at the far end of the corridor, clicked shut. Deborah pressed call. The phone call Deborah Stills made lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds. She stood near the medication dispensary, facing the wall so the remaining lobby staff couldn't see her face, and she spoke in a low, deliberate voice to a woman named Priya Nandal, who had left Hargrove Medical Center 14 months ago under circumstances that the HR department had documented as mutual separation by agreement, and that everyone who'd been there at the time understood as something considerably less mutual than that. Priya had been a charge nurse on the 3rd floor. She'd raised concerns about billing irregularities, not to administration, but to a colleague, in what she'd believed was a private conversation. Within 6 weeks, she was on a performance improvement plan. Within 4 months, she was gone. Deborah had watched it happen and had told herself it wasn't her business, that she didn't have enough information, that getting involved would only make things worse. She'd been telling herself variations of that same thing ever since. "They fired her in the ER," Deborah said. "In front of everyone. He hit her, Priya." A pause on the other end. Then, "Hit her how?" Across the face, open hand, hard enough that you could hear it at the nursing station. Another pause, longer. "Who's in there with her now?" "Military, a lieutenant commander. He came in on a helicopter, an actual helicopter. It's sitting in the parking lot. And he walked straight to Fitch, and now they're in the conference room." Deborah pressed her back against the wall. "I don't know what's happening, but I think something is finally happening." "Are there other people who saw it? The assault?" "At least a dozen, probably more. There were patients in the waiting room." She heard Priya exhale. Not dramatically, just the sound of someone making a decision they'd been postponing for over a year. "I'm calling Marcus," Priya said. "He kept records. He kept everything." "Priya." "I know. I'll call you back." The line went dead. Deborah stood against the wall for another 10 seconds, phone at her side. Then she straightened up, walked back to the nursing station, and sat down at her terminal. She pulled up the system activity log for Bay 6 and began reading it from the beginning with the careful, methodical attention of someone who had finally decided to pay attention. The conference room at Hargrove was designed to project a certain image: long table, leather chairs, framed accreditation certificates on the walls, the kind of room that communicated institutional seriousness and stability. Gerald Fitch used it for budget meetings, board presentations, and the occasional staff termination when he wanted to maintain a particular atmosphere. He had not anticipated using it for this. He sat at the head of the table with the HR director, Sylvia Greer, at his right. Sylvia was 51, efficient, and possessed of a talent for reframing situations that had served the hospital well for 9 years. She had her laptop open and was already in the process of locating documents, though her expression was calibrated carefully to suggest she was simply being organized rather than preparing a defense. Rafferty sat across from them. He hadn't asked where to sit. He'd simply taken the chair directly opposite Fitch, which put them at equal distance from the head of the table and created a geometry in the room that Fitch found subtly irritating in a way he couldn't immediately explain. The woman in the civilian jacket, she'd introduced herself as Investigator Cassidy Holt, and given no further elaboration, sat at Rafferty's right with her tablet face down on the table. She hadn't opened it since they sat down. Mara sat beside Rafferty. She'd been offered coffee by someone in the corridor and had declined. She had her hands flat on the table and was looking at Fitch with an expression that Rafferty had clocked when she stood up from the concrete barrier in the parking lot and hadn't fully understood until now. It wasn't anger. It wasn't nerves. It was something much more patient than either. Fitch said, "I want to be clear about the hospital's position before we go any further." "Go ahead," Rafferty said. "The nurse in question violated established intake protocol for uninsured patients. That protocol exists for regulatory and liability reasons that I'm sure you can appreciate. The decision to terminate was a difficult one, but it was procedurally sound, and I'm confident that—" "The nurse in question," Rafferty said, "closed a wound that would have continued bleeding for another 20 to 30 minutes under your intake protocol. The patient is 73 years old and was already showing signs of volume depletion when she brought him inside." He paused. "That's not a protocol violation. That's a medical judgment call, and by any clinical standard, it was the right one." Fitch's jaw shifted in the way Mara recognized. "The clinical merits are—" "I'm not finished." Rafferty's voice was still even, but something in it had sharpened, the way a temperature drops before weather rolls in. "The clinical merits are actually the least of what I'm interested in right now. What I'm interested in is what I'm going to find when Investigator Holt requests your security footage from the ER floor between 11 a.m. and noon today." Sylvia Greer's typing slowed almost imperceptibly. Fitch said, "The security system is a hospital asset, and any request for footage would need to go through. It would need to go through the appropriate channels, yes. We're familiar with the channels." Rafferty looked at Holt. She turned her tablet face up, tapped something twice, and turned it back down. "We've already initiated a request. It should resolve within the next few hours." He looked back at Fitch. "In the meantime, I want to hear your account of what occurred in the ER corridor. In your own words." The room went quiet. Fitch looked at Sylvia. She had gone very still, her hands flat beside her keyboard, and she gave him nothing in return. Not support, not a signal, not even the professional blankness she deployed in difficult meetings. Just stillness. "I had a verbal altercation with the nurse," Fitch said, "in which I communicated the hospital's decision to terminate her employment. The situation was tense. I would characterize my conduct as—" "Did you make physical contact with her?" Rafferty said. A pause. "There may have been—" "Did you or did you not strike Nurse Elston in the face?" The word strike landed in the room differently than any of the other words that had been spoken. Sylvia's hands moved back to her keyboard and then away again. Fitch looked at the table. He looked at Rafferty. He looked briefly and with an expression that was hard to categorize at Mara. "The incident was not—" "I need a yes or a no, Director Fitch." Fitch said nothing. Rafferty let the silence sit for 10 seconds. Then he said, "We're going to take a short recess. Investigator Holt is going to step out and make a call. I'd suggest you use the time to contact your legal representation." He stood. Mara stood. Holt picked up her tablet and was at the door before either of them. Fitch's voice came from behind them, finally stripped of its careful management. "You don't have jurisdiction over a civilian hospital's internal personnel decisions." Rafferty stopped at the door. He didn't turn around immediately. When he did, his expression was the same. Level, unhurried, decided. "You're right," he said. "Personnel decisions are yours. What happened to Ms. Elston's face isn't." He opened the door, and they walked out. In the corridor, Holt moved 20 feet down the hall and put her phone to her ear without explanation. Rafferty and Mara stood near the wall, outside the conference room door, close enough to speak quietly. "He's not going to admit it voluntarily," Mara said. "He doesn't have to." Rafferty looked down the corridor toward the lobby. "The footage will show what it shows, and there were 12 people in that room." He looked at her. "How many of them do you think will say nothing?" "Most of them," she said. It wasn't bitterness, just an assessment. "Most isn't all." She thought about Deborah Stills, about the way Deborah's head had been down when she walked out, how she hadn't looked up. But she also remembered, and this was something she hadn't thought about until this moment, that Deborah had, at some point in the last year, started eating lunch alone, had stopped attending the staff social events she used to organize, had developed the particular kind of quietness that comes from carrying something you can't put down.
"There's a charge nurse," Mara said slowly. "Deborah Stills. I don't know if she'll talk, but she's been here long enough to know where the bodies are. I'll need her name in whatever statement you're willing to give. I'll give whatever statement you need." Rafferty looked at her. Not the way people usually looked at her at work. The evaluative, calibrating look of someone trying to figure out how much of a problem she was going to be. This was something more direct than that.
"Can I ask you something?" he said. "You're going to whether I say yes or not."
"Why did you take the job here? With your background, you could have gone." "I wanted somewhere quiet," she said. "I wanted to do the work without the rest of it." "The rest of it meaning?" She looked at the conference room door. "The structure, the hierarchy, the way everything is about rank and command and who answers to who." She paused. "I spent years in that. I'm good at it. I didn't want it anymore."
Rafferty was quiet for a moment. Then, "Walter told me about the situation. Not everything. Walter doesn't tell everything to anyone, but enough." "How long have you known him?" "Long enough that when he calls, I answer." He shifted his weight slightly. "He said you didn't flinch." She understood what he meant. She didn't need it explained. "Old habit," she said. Holt came back down the corridor, phone still in hand. "Footage request is processing. They've got a compliance obligation, and they know it, so we should have it within 2 hours." She looked at Rafferty. "Also, there's someone at the front desk asking for you. Staff nurse, by the look of her. She told the front desk she has information she wants to give voluntarily." Rafferty looked at Mara. "Deborah," Mara said. Tamam. It was, in fact, Deborah Stills. She was sitting in one of the lobby chairs near the window when they came out, her hands folded over her phone in her lap, her spine straight in the way of someone trying to look more certain than they felt. She stood up when she saw Mara. "I didn't know," Deborah said, and then stopped, because that wasn't quite right. And she was self-aware enough to know it. "I didn't do enough. That's more accurate." "Okay," Mara said. "He's done it before. Not hitting. I don't know if he's done that before. But the rest of it. The way he talks to staff. The things he does to people's careers when they push back." Deborah's jaw was tight. "I watched him do it to Priya Nandal, and I told myself I didn't know enough to say anything. Then I watched it start happening to you, and I told myself the same thing." She looked at Mara directly. "I'm sorry, for what that's worth." Mara held her gaze for a moment. "Tell Lieutenant Commander Rafferty what you know. All of it. That's what it's worth." Deborah nodded and turned to Rafferty, and Mara stepped back and let them talk. She moved to the window. The helicopter was still in the parking lot, rotors still. The specialist who'd stayed with it was standing just inside the main rotor arc with his arms crossed and his collar up against the rain, which had steadied into a proper fall now. The mountains were completely gone behind the weather. The lot was almost empty. Just the military aircraft and a scatter of staff cars and the concrete barrier where she'd been sitting 45 minutes ago. She pressed 2 fingers against her cheekbone experimentally. Still warm. Probably visible. She'd have to deal with that at some point. Documentation, photographs, whatever the process required. She understood the process. She'd been trained in it for reasons that had nothing to do with civilian hospitals. What she hadn't been trained for was standing in a lobby in wet scrubs with her name on a termination form and her cheek marked, and a man she'd never met before today arranging events around her in ways she hadn't asked for and couldn't quite object to. Rafferty meant well. She could read that. And Walter had called him, which meant Walter trusted him, which was not an insignificant data point because Walter Pruitt had a specific and well-earned quality of judgment that she'd understood from the first 10 minutes in Bay 6. But she had always been the one making the calls. 12 years of being the one with the most complete picture in the room, the one whose judgment the situation turned on. Even after she'd left that life, she'd kept it. She'd built the nursing career around it, the quiet competence, the ability to walk into an emergency and see it clearly. Now she was standing at a window watching someone else organize the room. She put her hand down from her cheek. She turned back and looked at Deborah, who was talking to Rafferty with the focused intensity of someone releasing pressure that had been building for a long time. And Rafferty was listening in the particular way of someone who knew how to extract information efficiently without making the process feel like extraction. Holt had her tablet out now and was typing. This was happening with or without her. Mara crossed back to them. I want to talk to the staff, she said. Rafferty looked up. The ER staff? Everyone who was in that corridor before anyone has a chance to compare notes or decide what they saw? She looked at Deborah. Is there anywhere they'd all be right now, as a group? Deborah thought. Shift change briefing is at 3. They use the staff lounge on the ground floor. With everything that's happened, most of today's staff has been floating. Nobody's gone home. I think half of them are waiting to see what happens. Mara looked at Rafferty. He said, What are you thinking? I'm thinking that if we wait for the footage and the statements and the formal process, half of those people will have had enough time to get scared. And when people get scared, their memories get convenient. She paused. If I talk to them first, not as an investigator, just as someone they know, some of them might say things they wouldn't say in a formal setting. That's not standard. No, she agreed. Rafferty studied her for a moment. She could see him calculating. Not whether to trust her judgment, she thought, but whether the method was worth the variables. It was the kind of calculation she'd made herself many times in situations considerably less comfortable than a hospital lobby. Holt comes with you, he said. Fine. And you let people speak voluntarily. You don't push. I know how to talk to people, Commander. I know you do. I'm saying it for my own record. She looked at him, a real look, the kind that took a measure, and he held it without shifting. Understood, she said. The staff lounge was a mid-sized room off the main ER corridor with a row of lockers along one wall, a long table in the center, and a coffee station that had seen genuinely heavy use judging by the rings burned into the counter. When Mara walked in with Holt behind her, there were 11 people in the room. 4 nurses, 2 residents, an attending physician named Dr. Weston Core, who looked like he hadn't slept in a day and a half, a radiology tech, 2 paramedics who'd been on a run when everything happened and had come back to a very different building, and a patient transport aide named Ronnie, who was 18 years old and had been at Hargrove for 4 months and looked at this particular moment like he very much wished he hadn't been. The room went quiet when she walked in. Not uncomfortable quiet. Something more complicated. The quiet of people who are relieved and unsettled by the same event. Mara didn't preamble it. I'm not here officially. I'm here because I worked with most of you for 8 months, and I'd rather talk to you than have someone else do it for me. She pulled a chair out from the table and sat down, which dropped her below the eye line of half the people in the room, which was intentional. Investigator Holt is here as a witness to whatever gets said. She won't compel anyone to speak. This is voluntary, Dr. Core said from his position near the window. What are they going to do to Fitch? I don't know yet. That depends on a lot of things. Does it depend on us? Some of it. He looked at the floor, then back at her. He was a careful man. She'd worked with him enough to know that. He was also, she'd noticed over 8 months, the only attending who consistently checked his own assumptions in a differential. He was good. He was also, she suspected, good at knowing which battles to pick. I saw it, he said. I was at the station across from the corridor. I saw the whole thing. Nobody else moved. Then the radiology tech, a woman named Sue, late 20s, who Mara knew primarily from lab result handoffs, said, So did I. I was coming out of imaging. Then one of the nurses. Then Ronnie, who looked surprised at himself for speaking and then resolved, not everyone. The 2 paramedics said nothing, which was fine. They'd been off-site and hadn't seen it. One of the residents shook her head almost imperceptibly and looked out the window, and Mara didn't push it because she'd said she wouldn't. But 5 people, 6 including Deborah, who was in the lobby with Rafferty, 7 if she counted the patient in the waiting room that Holt had flagged as a possible witness on the way down the corridor. 7 people. That was a different number than 0. Dr. Core said, There's more than what happened today. Mara looked at him. The intake protocol changes from 18 months ago, the restructured triage criteria. He was choosing his words carefully, looking at Holt as much as at Mara. I raised concerns through the appropriate channels. Twice. In writing. He stopped. And? Mara said. And my performance review 3 months later was the first negative review I've had in 14 years of medicine. He said it flatly, without self-pity. I have the documentation. I kept copies of everything. Holt's pen was moving. I'll need those documents, Dr. Core. I have them at home. I can have them here within the hour.
Mara sat with that for a moment. The triage restructuring. She'd seen the effects of it, the way certain patients waited while others moved, but she'd never had a clear line to the origin. If CORE had documentation of the changes and of a retaliatory review pattern, that was a different conversation than a single assault charge. That was a pattern, and patterns had a way of changing what individual events looked like in retrospect. She became aware that Ronnie, the transport aide, had been working up to saying something. He was young enough that she could see the internal process on his face, the measuring, the calculation of what it cost. "There's a patient," he said, "in room 12. He's been there for 3 days. Medicare situation." He swallowed. "I heard Fitch tell the floor administrator to make it uncomfortable. Those were the words, make it uncomfortable." The room was very still. "When was this?" Holt said. "Yesterday afternoon. I was in the hall. I don't think they knew I could hear." Mara looked at the floor for a moment. 18 months of restructured triage, retaliatory reviews, a patient being made uncomfortable on administrative direction. And today in a corridor, an open palm strike that 12 people had witnessed and nobody had moved to intervene. She thought about all the places she'd been in her life where the machinery of authority had been used to protect itself, and how in each of those places the machinery had kept running until something hit it at the right angle. She looked up at Ronnie. "That patient in room 12, is he still there?" "As far as I know." "Does he know that what's happening to him isn't standard care?" Ronnie shook his head slowly. "I don't think anyone's told him anything." Mara stood up. She looked at Holt. "I want to see him." Holt said, "You don't have credentials." "I have 8 months of charts in this building and a nursing license that Fitch doesn't have the authority to touch." She looked at Holt steadily. "And I'm not going to treat him. I'm going to talk to him." Holt looked at her tablet, looked at Mara, made a decision. "I'm coming with you," she said. Room 12 was on the second floor, in the medical surgical unit. The patient's name, according to the whiteboard outside his door, was Ellis Drummond. He was 68, and when Mara pushed the door open, he was sitting up in bed in the particular posture of someone who has been waiting for a long time and has run out of things to think about while waiting. The room was cold, noticeably, specifically cold, in a way that seemed less like an HVAC inconsistency and more like a setting that had been deliberately adjusted. There was no extra blanket on the chair. The meal tray from what looked like lunch had been removed. He looked up when she came in. "Are you my nurse?" he said. He said it without hope, the way a question sounds when it's become reflexive rather than expectant. "No," she said. "I'm someone who works here." She pulled the chair next to his bed. "How are you feeling?" "Cold." He looked at the window, which was fine, not drafty. "They keep saying they'll look into the temperature situation. That was yesterday. Have you been told what's happening with your case, with the insurance review?" He looked at her more carefully. "They said it's complicated. They keep saying it's complicated." He had the voice of someone who'd spent their life not making trouble and who had run into a system that interpreted that as an opportunity. "I just need to know what's happening. I can't get a straight answer from anyone." Mara said, "I'm going to make sure someone gives you a straight answer today, a real one." He studied her face, saw the mark on her cheek. She could tell when people noticed it, a slight adjustment in their eyes. He didn't mention it. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" he said. "Not anymore," she said. And it surprised her a little as she said it to find that she meant it. She stood up and asked him if he wanted an extra blanket, and he said yes. And she went to the supply closet in the hall and got one and brought it back and settled it over him without making it a production. Then she took Holt back to the corridor. "The room temperature," she said to Holt. "I want that documented. The time, the setting, the patient's stated experience." "Already done," Holt said, tablet in hand. "Is it enough? With everything else?" Holt looked at her. She was hard to read. Her face had the professional neutrality of someone trained to gather and not editorialize. But something in it had shifted slightly over the last hour. The billing irregularities CORE mentioned, the triage restructuring, the retaliatory reviews, the assault, and this. She nodded back toward room 12. "Individually, any one of them is a problem.
Together, they're a pattern of conduct that triggers mandatory reporting to the State Health Commission and potentially federal oversight. She paused. So yes, it's enough. They took the stairs back down. In the lobby, Rafferty was no longer at the desk. Deborah caught Mara's eye from across the room and tilted her head toward the administrative corridor. Mara went that direction and found Rafferty standing outside the conference room door, his arms crossed, looking at his phone with an expression that was controlled but not entirely. What happened? Mara said. Btch's attorney arrived. That was fast. Hospital keeps one on retainer. Apparently she got here in 11 minutes, which tells you something about how often they need her. He looked up from his phone. They've stopped cooperating voluntarily. Footage request is now going through formal channels, which means delays. How long? Could be hours. Could be longer if they push it. He put his phone away. They're going to try to slow this down. Give him time to manage the narrative. Mara thought about Deborah's call to Priya, about Marcus, whoever Marcus was, who kept records and had kept everything, about Dr. Kaur's documentation sitting at home on a hard drive, about 7 witnesses who had said what they saw before anyone had a chance to coach them. They already waited too long to slow it down, she said. Rafferty looked at her. Kaur has documentation of the triage changes and retaliatory reviews, she said. He's getting it now. There's a patient upstairs who can testify to being deliberately made uncomfortable on administrative direction, and Holt documented the room temperature. I have verbal statements from 6 witnesses to the assault, and Deborah Stills can speak to a pattern of conduct going back at least 14 months. She held his gaze. Btch's attorney can delay the footage for as long as the legal machinery allows, but she can't delay any of that. Rafferty was quiet for a moment. You did all of that in the last 40 minutes, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I did what I could with what was available. He looked at her with the particular expression she'd seen cross his face a few times today. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recalibration. Holt, he said. Holt, who had come up behind them, said, Already compiling. Rafferty turned back to the conference room door. Then he stopped. From behind the door came the muffled but distinct sound of raised voices. At least 2 of them. One she recognized as Btch. The other was a woman's voice, not the attorney, someone different, and it had the specific quality of someone who is not yelling but who has stopped being careful. Then a third voice, a man's. And something in the cadence of it made Rafferty's posture change. He put his hand on the conference room door handle. The voices behind it went abruptly quiet. The door opened from the inside. Standing in the doorway, flanked by Sylvia Greer and a pale-faced man in a suit who was presumably the hospital's attorney, was a woman Mara had never seen before. She was in her mid-50s, with close-cut steel gray hair and the kind of bearing that filled doorways efficiently. She was wearing a federal badge on a lanyard around her neck, and she was holding a document that she extended to Rafferty without breaking her stride. Commander Rafferty. Her voice was precise and unhurried. Special Agent Dara Swick, HHS, Office of Inspector General. We got the flag from your investigator 40 minutes ago. She looked past him at Mara. Are you Mara Elston? Yes, Mara said. Swick studied her face for 1 second. I've read your file. Mara said nothing. Not the Hargrove file, Swick said. The other one. The hallway was absolutely still. Rafferty hadn't moved. Holt had stopped typing. Btch, visible now behind Swick in the doorway of the conference room, had gone the color of old paper. I have a warrant for administrative records going back 24 months, Swick said to no one in particular. And I have 2 more agents walking through the front door in approximately, she checked her watch, 90 seconds. She looked at Btch. You're going to want to sit back down, Director. Btch sat down. Swick handed the document to Rafferty, looked at Mara once more with an expression that was impossible to fully decode, and turned back into the conference room. The door stayed open. Mara looked at Rafferty. He looked at the document in his hand, then he looked at her with something she hadn't seen from him all day. Something that was not quite concern, but was close to it. Elston, he said quietly, how much of your service record did you disclose on your Hargrove application? She knew where this was going. She'd always known, distantly, that it would go here eventually. She just hadn't expected it to be today. The minimum required, she said, which means what they found in your file.
is considerably more than what they expected to find. She looked at the open conference room door, at Swick's back, at Fitch's gray face behind her. Yes.
Rafferty looked at her for a long moment.
What are they going to do with it? He asked, and the way he asked it, not as an investigator, not officially, just as a person in a hallway, told her that whatever Walter had said to him, it had included enough for him to understand that this question mattered. Before she could answer, Holt appeared at her elbow with her tablet turned face out. On the screen was a security camera still frame, timestamp 11:47 a.m., captured from a ceiling-mounted camera in the ER corridor. The image was perfectly clear. It showed Gerald Fitch's hand in motion. It showed Mara's face at the moment of impact. It showed 12 people in the background, every face visible, every one of them watching. And it showed, she hadn't known this, she'd been facing the other direction, that the bay curtain behind her was not fully drawn, and through the gap, visible in the frame, Walter Pruitt was watching from his bed with an expression that looked, even in grainy security camera resolution, like a man who had been waiting a long time for something to go right. The footage came through, Holt said. Their attorney didn't move fast enough. Mara looked at the image for a moment. At her own face in it caught mid-impact, expression completely unchanged. Then she looked up at the conference room where Swick was asking Fitch questions he was no longer in any position to avoid. Rafferty said quietly, "Elston?" "The service record." She looked at him. Outside through the lobby windows, she could see 2 more federal vehicles pulling into the parking lot, their headlights cutting through the rain. The 2 agents Swick had mentioned. Behind them, visible at the far edge of the lot, Walter Pruitt's wheelchair was a still shape in the rain, the old veteran watching the front entrance of the building he'd walked into with a bleeding arm and no insurance and absolute calm, like a man who had known, from the first moment, exactly what kind of woman he'd found at the side entrance. "There are things in that file," Mara said, "that I was never supposed to talk about." Rafferty said, "And now?" She looked at the tablet screen again, at 12 faces, at her own face, holding still. "Now," she said, "I don't think I have a choice." Rafferty didn't push her on it right then, which she appreciated. He had the instinct, she could see it, to ask the next question immediately, to follow the thread while it was live. But he held it, and she understood that he was giving her something she hadn't asked for and didn't know she needed, a moment to figure out how to say a thing she hadn't said to anyone in 3 years. Holt had moved away down the corridor, tablet in hand, coordinating something with the agents coming through the front entrance. The lobby had shifted again. More federal presence, the geometry of the building changing the way it changes when official authority moves through it. 2 agents in dark jackets were speaking to the front desk. A third was talking to Deborah Stills, who had the look of someone finally running out of things to hold back. Mara looked at the conference room door still open, Swick's voice audible inside it. Level. Precise. The kind of voice that has asked hard questions before and doesn't require an answer to be at full volume to land with weight. "Walk me through it," Rafferty said. Not a command. Close to a request. She crossed her arms, not defensively. More like bracing, the way you brace before physical effort. "I was a Navy corpsman. Did my initial training at Bethesda, field rotation in the Horn of Africa, then got picked up for a special operations support role." She stopped. "That's the part that's in the file. The standard part. And the non-standard part. 18 months embedded with a reconnaissance unit. 2 deployments. The second one went bad in a way that took a long time to officially document, because documenting it required acknowledging what the unit was doing and where they were doing it." She looked at the floor. "When I applied to Hargrove, I listed the corpsman service. I listed the field experience. I left out the classification because I was legally required to leave it out. But the file exists. The file exists in the sense that most of it is still classified, but the existence of the file isn't." She looked at him. If Swick pulled it, she pulled enough to know there's more she can't see. Which means she's going to have questions about why a nurse with that kind of background is working a general ER in Denton Falls, Colorado. Rafferty said, "Is that a problem?" "I don't know yet." She said it honestly, without the reflex to sound more confident than she was. "Depends what she does with it." "What she does with it," Rafferty said, "is not going to be the problem Fitch is expecting. She's OIG. She followed the flag Holt sent on the billing irregularities and the triage restructuring.
Whatever else she found in your file is... He stopped, reconsidered. It complicates her narrative for this investigation. It doesn't change what Fitch did.
No, Mara said. It doesn't. From inside the conference room, Fitch's voice rose briefly and then stopped in the way that voices stop when someone interrupts with something worse than what you've just said. Mara and Rafferty both registered it without commenting on it. Walter knew, she said. When he saw me work in the bay, he knew what he was looking at. He usually does. How long has he been doing this? Showing up at places, making calls?
Rafferty's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, something smaller than that, but in the same direction. Walter Pruitt spent 31 years in uniform. He has a particular thing about situations where someone capable gets pushed out by someone who isn't. He paused. He's been doing some version of this for as long as I've known him. How many times has it worked? More than it hasn't. He looked at her directly. Including at least twice before today that you don't know about. She absorbed that. The idea of Walter moving through places, bleeding arm or something like it, watching, calling the right number. The idea of a man who had spent 3 decades in a system and come out of it not cynical but purposeful in a very specific direction. She thought about the moment in the parking lot when he'd asked her how long were you in and she'd said she didn't know what he was talking about, and he'd looked at her hands. He saw it in the bay, she said, almost to herself. The way I irrigated, the sequence. The way you handled the IV placement, Rafferty said. He told me. He said it was field sequencing, not civilian clinical. Field. She'd known she was doing it. She always knew. In an emergency, the training surfaced whether she invited it or not. The priority order, the efficiency, the habit of working as though resupply was not coming, and the next 15 minutes were all she had. She'd been conscious of it in Bay 6 and had told herself nobody would notice. Walter had noticed in under 9 minutes. A shout from inside the conference room, not Fitch this time, the attorney. Sharp and clipped, the sound of someone who has just heard something they were not prepared to hear. Then Swick's voice, still level, a single sentence that Mara couldn't make out through the door. Then silence. Rafferty turned toward the conference room. Mara was a step behind him. What? Inside, the dynamic had rearranged itself completely. Fitch was sitting at the table, which he had been when they'd left, but his posture had changed in a specific way. The particular collapse of someone whose position has just stopped being theoretical. The attorney, a woman in her 40s named Kellerman, whose tailored jacket was now less of an asset and more of a reminder of how quickly situations change, was standing at the far end of the table with one hand flat on its surface and her phone in the other. Sylvia Greer was not in the room. Mara noted this without commenting on it. On the table in front of Swick were 3 printed documents and a tablet showing what appeared to be a financial ledger, though Mara was too far away to read the specific figures. Swick looked up when they entered. Commander Rafferty, I was about to send someone for you. She glanced at Mara. And you as well. This involves you directly. Rafferty moved to the table. Mara came to the edge of it, standing rather than sitting, because something in the room's arrangement made sitting feel like the wrong choice. We pulled the administrative billing records, Swick said, which your attorney has just reminded me require a separate warrant, which we have, and which is why she's currently looking like that. She said it without inflection, not unkindly, but not softly either. She looked at one of the documents. Over the past 22 months, Hargrove Medical Center has systematically billed Medicare and Medicaid for procedures at a rate inconsistent with the documented level of care. The variance is approximately 11% across roughly 4,000 patient records. She looked up. That number is preliminary. We'll know more when we've had the full records for longer than 40 minutes. Kellerman said tightly, My client disputes. Your client can dispute in writing and through proper channels, Swick said. She looked at Fitch. Director Fitch, the triage restructuring that took effect 18 months ago. I need to know who authorized it. Fitch looked at his attorney. She shook her head slightly. I'm advising my client not to answer at this. The restructuring documentation, Swick continued, as though the objection hadn't occurred, lists a Dr. Arthur Vanek as the clinical authority for the new protocols. Dr. Vanek has not been on active staff here for 14 months. His name appears on at least 30 documents filed after his departure. She turned a page. I want to know who was signing for him. The room was very quiet. Mara looked at Fitch. She'd spent 8 months watching his face perform confidence and authority, and she'd learned its tells. The slight tension at the corners of his eyes when he was calculating, the way his jaw moved right before he decided to push back on something. Both were visible now, but the calculus behind them had changed. He was no longer calculating how to manage the situation. He was calculating whether cooperating with a narrow piece of it would protect him from the larger piece. It wouldn't, but she understood why he was still trying. Kellerman leaned down and said something inaudible close to Fitch's ear. Fitch's jaw shifted. He looked at the table. He looked at Swick. Sylvia Greer handled administrative documentation for those protocols, he said. Kellerman straightened up sharply. That had not been what she'd suggested. Swick said, "Where is Ms. Greer now?" Nobody answered immediately. Mara said, "She left the conference room about 20 minutes ago." Swick looked at one of her agents at the door. He stepped out immediately. "Director Fitch," Swick said, "I'm going to need you to stay in this building." Fitch said nothing. He looked like a man who had spent years arranging things and had just become aware that the arrangement was a structure with no foundation. Rafferty stepped back into the corridor. Mara followed. "Greer," he said, low. "She left when you and Holt took us to the lounge," Mara said. "I didn't clock it at the time. She knew what was coming. She's been covering it for him, the documentation, the fake signatures, the billing. She knew the moment you walked into the building." Mara scanned the corridor automatically. North end, south end, stairwell access, elevator. If she's smart, she's already in her car. Rafferty had his phone out. He spoke 2 sentences into it and walked toward the lobby. Mara stayed in the corridor for a moment. The investigation was moving on its own momentum now. The footage, the documents Core was bringing, the statements already given, the billing records on Swick's table. It would continue whether she was in the room or not. Rafferty would manage the federal coordination. Swick would manage the legal architecture. Holt would compile everything into something that would take months to fully process. What Mara was thinking about was Ellis Drummond in room 12. And she was thinking about the patient transport aide named Ronnie, 18 years old, who had heard a hospital director tell an administrator to make a patient stay deliberately uncomfortable, and who had said so in a room full of colleagues without anyone telling him he should. She was thinking about Dr. Core driving home right now to get documents he'd kept for a year, in a folder, in the private way of someone who keeps things because they've learned that institutions revise their own histories, and the only counter to that is paper. She was thinking about Priya Nandal, who'd been pushed out 14 months ago and who Deborah had called, and about Marcus, whoever Marcus was, who had kept everything. All of it had been there, the whole time. In this building, in these people, in the records that Fitch had been certain were either buried or controlled. It had been there, and it had been waiting for exactly this kind of pressure. And the pressure had arrived today because a 73-year-old man with a lacerated arm had walked into the wrong entrance and found the right nurse. She walked to the elevator and went up to the second floor. Room 12 was quieter than it had been earlier. Ellis Drummond had the blanket she'd brought pulled up to his sternum and the television off. And he looked up when she came in with an expression that had changed since the last time. Not hope exactly, but its precursor. The quality of someone who has been given a reason to think that something might actually happen. "You came back," he said. "I said I would." She pulled the chair close. "I need to ask you some things. You don't have to answer them." "Go ahead." "In the last 3 days, has anyone from administration spoken to you directly about your insurance situation? A specific person, not a nurse, not a resident." He thought about it carefully. "A woman. Came in yesterday morning. She didn't introduce herself. She talked about the review process, said it was taking longer than expected, said they might need me to get a secondary assessment before they could proceed." He frowned. "It didn't sound right to me, but I don't know the system well enough to know what right sounds like." "Did she say anything about your room, your comfort, anything like that?" "She mentioned—" He stopped, seeming to reach back. "She said something about room assignments, that I might need to be moved to a different unit while the review was pending." He paused. "And the temperature. She said they'd been having issues with the system on this floor. I've been cold since yesterday, and I thought maybe she was right about that." Mara thought about Sylvia Greer's face in the conference room, the stillness of it. "I want you to write down everything you can remember about that conversation," she said. "The time, what she looked like, what she said, as much detail as you can." She looked around the room,
found a notepad on the windowsill with the hospital's header on it, and held it out to him. "Can you do that?" "Yes," he said, and took it. "Someone will come to speak with you officially in the next hour or two. Tell them everything."
He was already writing. She watched him for a moment. A 68-year-old man writing notes in a cold room in a hospital that had been treating his discomfort as an administrative tool, and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite sadness, and was somewhere in the territory between them where things that are both complicated and simple coexist. She left the room. In the hallway, she almost walked into Holt, who was coming off the elevator with her tablet and a look that meant new information. "Greer's car is still in the lot," Holt said. "She didn't leave the building. The agent is checking the administrative wing floor by floor." "She's looking for something," Mara said. "A file, we think. She accessed the record system from an admin terminal on the third floor 11 minutes ago. She was looking at archived documentation for the triage restructuring. She's trying to pull it. We locked the system 2 minutes after the access log showed up." Holt paused. She didn't get what she was looking for. Mara thought about that. About Greer, somewhere in this building, having just found out that the system she'd been managing for 18 months had been locked around her, realizing that the window she'd been trying to reach had closed. What does a person do in that moment? "Where on the third floor?" Mara said. "The document archive. End of the administrative corridor." "Is there a service stairwell off the administrative corridor?" Holt looked at her. Then she was on her radio. "Btch mo amasan." The service stairwell on the third floor opened onto a landing that served the loading dock on the building's north side. Mara took the stairs at a pace that was not quite running. She was still in wet scrubs and rubber-soled nursing shoes, and the stairs were concrete with a thin grip strip that would turn against her if she moved too fast. She went down one flight, hit the second-floor landing, and kept going. She heard the door below before she saw it, a push-bar release, the specific sound of a fire door opening from the inside. She came around the stairwell's half-turn and saw the north side exit door just closing. She went through it. The loading dock was covered but open on the north side, facing a service road that ran behind the hospital building. The rain was coming sideways now, pushed by wind that had picked up in the last hour. The dock was empty of vehicles. Supply delivery wasn't due until tomorrow, but the space was full of the kind of equipment loading docks collect. Stacked pallets, a maintenance cart, a generator housing near the back wall. Sylvia Greer was standing at the edge of the dock, 6 feet from the service road, with a leather portfolio under her arm and her phone in her hand. She was looking at the road, then at the phone, then at the road again, in the way of someone doing a calculation that keeps coming out wrong. She heard Mara's footsteps on the dock surface and turned. They looked at each other. Greer was 51 years old and had spent 9 years being indispensable to a man who had just thrown her name across a conference room table to redirect fire from himself. She was smart enough to know exactly what that meant and composed enough not to show most of what she felt about it. But not all of it. Her eyes were doing something her face had been trained not to do. "You locked the system," she said. It was almost conversational. "Not me. The OIG agent. I just needed one file." She said it without heat. Proof that the protocol changes were his direction, not mine. That I was implementing, not originating. She stopped. "Not that you care." "I don't have a position on it," Mara said honestly. "If you have documentation that separates your role from his, you should give it to Special Agent Swick. Voluntarily. Right now is the right time for that." Greer looked at the service road. "He told me it was regulatory optimization. That's what he called it. 18 months ago, he sat in that conference room and said regulatory optimization, and I wrote the documentation because that's what I've done for 9 years. Something crossed her face. "I knew what it was. I'm not claiming I didn't. I'm saying there's a difference between knowing and directing." "There is," Mara said. "But that's a distinction you make in a legal context, not on a loading dock in the rain." Greer looked at her. "You could run," Mara said. "Your car is in the lot, but there's a service road right there, and you could probably get a ride share in under 10 minutes. You'd have maybe an hour before it became significantly worse than it is right now." "Why are you telling me that?" "Because I want you to understand that you're choosing right now between 2 real options. Not between running and being caught. Between 2 different versions of what comes next." Mara held her gaze.
The one where you walk back in and tell Swick what you know, everything you know, including what was his and what was yours. And the one where you make it worse. Greer was quiet. The rain hit the dock's edge and threw spray sideways across the concrete. "He's going to say it was all me," she said. "He already started." "He did," Mara said. "And there are now several federal agents, 6 voluntary witness statements, a physician's documentation of retaliatory review practices, and a security footage still showing exactly what Gerald Btch is capable of when he's not being careful. So whatever he says about you exists in that context." She paused. "You're not his best play anymore. He's going to look for someone else." Something shifted in Greer's expression. Not relief, but a related quality. The kind of clarity that comes when someone stops trying to hold too many things at once. "I kept copies," she said quietly, "of everything. Not to protect myself, She stopped. "I kept them because I knew. I knew what it was." "Then you have something to give them," Mara said. A beat. Then Greer turned away from the service road and walked back toward the stairwell door. Mara followed her in. Holt met them on the 3rd floor with 2 agents and a controlled expression that became somewhat less controlled when she saw Greer walking beside Mara without resistance. She organized it quickly, took Greer toward the administrative conference suite on 3, and looked back at Mara once with something that might have been a wordless acknowledgement before the door closed. Mara stood in the 3rd floor corridor alone for a moment. She was wet through. Her scrubs were cold against her skin and her nursing shoes had soaked through sometime in the parking lot, and she hadn't noticed until now, the way you don't notice physical things when you're running on task. The mark on her cheek, when she touched it briefly, had gone from warm to a dull specific ache. She went to the elevator and rode down to the ground floor. The lobby had continued its transformation. 2 more federal vehicles in the lot now. A uniformed officer near the front desk. The waiting room, which had been occupied by a handful of patients all morning, had been cleared. Someone had arranged alternative waiting elsewhere, she assumed. The whole ground floor had the quality of a building that has been officially seized, which was not quite what was happening, but was close enough that the remaining staff were responding to it that way, moving carefully, speaking quietly, checking credentials before doing anything that might be noticed. Rafferty was at the nursing station with Dr. Kaur, who had returned from home with a manila folder thick enough that its contents were visible as a slight fan at the top edge. He was talking to Rafferty in the focused manner of someone who has been waiting to have this particular conversation for a long time and is trying not to move too fast through it. Walter was near the window. Someone had found him a dry blanket at some point, and it was folded across his lap. He was watching the lot, the way he'd been watching everything all day, with that patient external stillness that Mara had recognized from the first moment and that she now understood had a very specific origin. She crossed to him. He looked up, looked at her face, looked at her wet clothes. "You've been busy," he said. "Greer's in custody, voluntarily." She sat down in the chair someone had placed next to him. "She has documentation that separates her role from Btch's, which means she has something to negotiate with, which means we'll know more about the billing structure than we would have otherwise." "Good." "Btch is still in the conference room." She paused. "He threw her under first chance he had." "That surprises you?" "No." She looked at the lot. "Not even a little." They sat quietly for a moment. Outside, the rain had eased slightly. Not stopping, just recalibrating, the way Colorado weather does, deciding whether it was finished. "Rafferty's going to want to know about the deployment," she said. "Eventually. Swick already pulled enough to know the file is heavier than a standard service record." Walter looked at her sidelong. "Is that a problem for you?" She thought about it honestly, the way she'd been trying to think about things honestly all day. "It might be, depending on what they decide to do with it." She looked at her hands. "I left because I needed to leave. The things I did..." She stopped, not because the words weren't there, but because some things have a texture in the mouth that makes you measure each one. "I did things that were necessary. I don't regret them, but they sit differently than other parts of the work." "That's true of most things worth doing," Walter said. She looked at him. "You knew from the start, in the bay." "I knew what I was looking at, yes." "Why call Rafferty? Why not just let it go? Let me get fired and move on." Walter turned his head toward her fully.
The first time he'd done that all day without something external prompting it. He had the face of a man who has been in enough situations to know exactly which ones matter and why, and the eyes of someone who does not say things he doesn't mean. Because people who can do what you can do, he said carefully, do not belong in parking lots in the rain with someone else's handprint on their face. She held his gaze. She didn't answer, partly because she didn't know what to say, and partly because Walter, she'd learned, did not require an answer to everything. Her phone buzzed. She'd picked it up from her locker on the way back from the second floor, one errand in the middle of everything else. She looked at the screen. It was a number she didn't recognize. Colorado area code, Denton Falls prefix. She answered it. "Is this Mara Elston?" A man's voice. Middle-aged, careful. Not nervous? Strategic. "Yes. My name is Marcus Teller. Priya Nandal gave me your number. I was a compliance officer at Hargrove from the year before last until 8 months ago." A pause. "I have documentation that I've been told the OIG is currently on site to receive. I want to bring it in voluntarily, but I want to speak to someone who isn't the hospital's attorney first." "How much documentation?" "Enough that you're going to want to make sure the right people are in the room when I bring it in." Another pause. "Ms. Elston, I've been sitting on this for 8 months because I didn't know who to trust with it. After today, I think I do." She looked at Walter. He was watching the lot again. "Come in the main entrance," she said. "Ask for Lieutenant Commander Rafferty. Tell him I sent you." "Understood." He paused once more, and in the pause was the weight of everything he'd been carrying. "I want you to know, when they pushed Priya out, I should have said something. I had all of this, and I sat on it because I was scared." His voice was steady, but barely. "I'm sorry it took this long." "Come in," she said. "Bring everything." She ended the call. She was still looking at the phone when Rafferty appeared at her elbow. "Corps' documentation is solid," he said. 14 months of retaliatory pattern, in writing, with dates and names. He looked at her. "What did I miss?" "A compliance officer named Marcus Teller is coming in voluntarily with documentation he's been holding for 8 months. She stood. "He was here before I was. He knows where things are buried." Rafferty processed that. "How many people in this building knew something was wrong and didn't say anything?" "More than said something," she said. "Less than you'd expect." She crossed the lobby toward the corridor where the work was still ongoing. Behind her, she heard Rafferty on his phone, relaying Teller's name to someone. The lobby continued its organized activity. Federal personnel, hospital staff in careful orbits around each other, the quiet machinery of a reckoning that had been building for longer than today. At the corridor entrance, Dr. Kaur intercepted her. "Btch," he said quietly, "he's asking for a private conversation with the federal agent in charge." "With Swick?" "That's what he asked for. The attorney's still in there with him, but she's..." He paused. "She's letting him drive, which means she's either confident or she knows she's losing and has stopped fighting the wheel." "What does he want to say?" "Nobody knows. But he asked specifically that you not be in the room." Mara looked at the conference room door at the far end of the corridor, thought about Fitch's face when the footage still appeared on Holt's tablet, the gray of it, the calculation going on behind it. "He's going to try to make a deal," she said. "That's what Rafferty thinks too. What he knows about the billing structure is probably worth something to Swick. There are people above him, suppliers, administrators at the system level, people who approve the protocol changes he'll be trying to redirect to." She paused. "If he gives them names, she might take it." "Does that..." Kaur stopped, chose words carefully. "Does that affect what happens to him?" "Not as much as he thinks," she said. "The assault on camera is a separate track from the federal investigation. Whatever he gives Swick doesn't touch that." Kaur nodded slowly. He looked like he wanted to say something else, and then didn't. "Dr. Kaur," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you for keeping those documents." He looked at the floor briefly. "I should have used them sooner." "Maybe," she said, "but you kept them. That mattered today." He nodded, not quite able to receive it fully, and moved back toward the nursing station. Mara went to the window at the end of the corridor that looked out over the east side of the building, the side that faced the mountains when the mountains were visible, which they currently were not. The rain had thickened again, the brief easing over. The glass was fogged at the edges and cold to the touch. She stood there for 3 minutes, which was the first 3 minutes all day that she hadn't been moving from one thing to the next. She thought about Greer on the loading dock, doing the math on 2 options. She thought about the moment in the conference room when Swick had said, "I've read your file," and then clarified the other one, and the way Rafferty had looked at her when Swick said it, and how neither of them had known, yet, what that was going to mean. She thought about 12 years of a life she had left for reasons that were hers and nobody else's, and how today had pulled the shape of that life back into the room without asking her permission. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass. Behind her, she heard quick footsteps in the corridor. Then Rafferty's voice. "Elston." The tone of it made her turn. He was at the corridor entrance, phone in hand, expression doing something controlled but not fully. "The conference room," he said. Btch started talking. "His attorney let him?" "His attorney walked out 2 minutes ago." He paused. "He's asking for immunity for testimony. Swick's processing it, but that's not—" He stopped. "He's claiming that the file, your service record, that someone provided it to him 6 months ago, before you were hired." She went very still. "Someone provided him a classified service record," she said. "A partial. Enough to know what you'd done and where you'd been." Rafferty's voice was even, but just. "He hired you specifically because of it." She looked at him. The corridor was quiet. The rain on the window behind her was a steady pressure. "He hired me," she said slowly, "because he knew. He says he was told you were someone who couldn't make noise, someone whose background meant she'd have to stay quiet about what she saw, because raising her head meant her own history coming up." His jaw was tight. He called it leverage. That's the word he used. Mara held that, the full shape of it, 8 months. Every shift, every observation she'd made and filed away and told herself wasn't her business to push on. Every moment of seeing the triage restructuring and the preferential billing and the casual cruelty of Btch's administration and making the same calculation, "I'm new here, I'm not in a position, keep your head down." It hadn't been instinct, it hadn't been wisdom, it had been exactly what someone had designed for her. She said, very quietly, "Who gave him the file?" "That's what Swick is asking him right now," Rafferty said. "That's why I'm here." She looked at the conference room door at the end of the corridor, the strip of light underneath it, the sounds coming through it, not audible words, just the presence of people, and the particular quality of a conversation that is deciding something. "I need to be in that room," she said. Swick said no witnesses during. "I need to be in that room." She looked at Rafferty. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Whoever gave him that file knew what they were doing. They used my service record as a containment mechanism for a corrupt hospital director, which means they either had access to classified records they shouldn't have had, or they had access to someone who did." She held his gaze. "That isn't a hospital story anymore." Rafferty looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the conference room door, then back at her. "Give me 30 seconds, he said. He walked to the conference room and knocked twice, opened the door, and said something to Swick that she couldn't hear. There was a pause. Another exchange. Then Rafferty pushed the door open. "1 minute, he said. Mara walked into the conference room. Btch looked up. He looked worse than he had an hour ago. Not just tired, but hollowed. The kind of hollow that comes from a structure collapsing while you're still inside it. His attorney's chair was empty. His coffee was cold. Swick was standing across the table from him with her arms crossed and the patience of someone who gets paid by the outcome, not the hour. Mara looked at Btch. "Who gave you the file?" she said. Btch looked at her. For a moment the old reflex appeared, the composure, the management, and then it was gone. And what was under it was something older and tireder and considerably more afraid. He looked at the table. He said a name. It landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Mara heard it, felt the recognition move through her. Not surprise exactly. Somewhere between recognition and the particular cold sensation of a pattern that has been just outside your peripheral vision finally rotating into view. She looked at Swick. Swick's expression had changed, and Swick's expression, Mara had learned in the last 2 hours, did not change easily. "Do you know this individual?" Swick said. "Yes," Mara said. "From your service." "Yes." Swick looked at her steadily. I need you to sit down, Miss Elston. We have considerably more to discuss than I thought. Outside the window, the last light of the afternoon was disappearing behind the weather, and the mountains were invisible, and the parking lot was full of federal vehicles, and somewhere in the building a man named Marcus Teller was walking through the front entrance with 8 months of buried evidence under his arm. And Mara Elston sat down across from a federal investigator and looked at the empty space where a name had just changed everything. The name was Carver. Not a first name, not yet. Just Carver, the way Fitch said it, flat and quick, like releasing pressure from a valve he'd been holding shut for months. But Mara didn't need the first name. She knew one Carver from her service, and the fact that she knew exactly who Fitch meant before he said another word told her the shape of this thing was much larger than a hospital in Denton Falls. Commander Elliot Carver, Naval Intelligence Liaison. She'd worked adjacent to him twice during her second deployment, never directly. He was the kind of person who existed at the edge of operations, the person who showed up in briefings to ask questions that weren't quite about what they appeared to be about. She'd formed a specific impression of him in those two interactions. The impression had been correct, apparently. "Tell me exactly how the contact was made," Swick said to Fitch. Fitch had the look of a man who has made a calculation and is hoping it works. Not repentant, calculating. He decided that talking was the play, but he was still managing what he said, still trying to control the shape of his own story, even as the walls came in. 18 months ago, he said, someone reached out through an intermediary, a consultant who works healthcare compliance. Name, Swick said, Dorian Marsh. He said it without hesitation, which meant either Marsh was someone he'd already decided to give up, or he wasn't worried about burning him. Marsh said he had a resource for us. Someone who could help the hospital address certain regulatory pressure points. He stopped, searching for language that put distance between him and his own decisions. He indicated this person had intelligence community connections that could help facilitate certain arrangements. And then, Mara said. Fitch looked at her. And then Marsh provided documentation, background material on a specific individual who he said would be an asset to the hospital's ER staff, and who would be, in his words, unlikely to cause institutional problems. Because of what the documentation contained, Mara said. Yes. He told you that if I ever raised concerns about hospital practices, you could use my service record to keep me quiet. Fitch didn't answer directly. He looked at the table, which was its own answer. Did you understand that providing that documentation was potentially illegal? Swick said. I understood that the documentation was unusual, Fitch said, with the careful syntax of someone whose attorney had spent years teaching him to be precise in exactly the wrong moments. Swick looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at Mara. Do you know if Commander Carver had legitimate access to your service record? He had access to some of my record through his liaison role, Mara said. The classified portions of the second deployment? No. Those would have required a specific clearance request with documented justification. So either he had access he shouldn't have, or someone above him did and he was the conduit. She paused. Either way, the information was used outside its authorized purpose. That's a violation regardless of how he got it. Swick turned to one of her agents at the door and said something in a voice too low to carry. The agent left. Rafferty, standing just inside the conference room, had gone very still in the way Mara had learned meant he was reorganizing his understanding of something significant. You know Carver, he said to her. I know of him. 2 briefings, different contexts. She looked at Rafferty directly. He would have known about me through the unit, not because we worked together, we didn't, but because he was the kind of person who made it his business to know the personnel attached to operations he was adjacent to. Why would he do this? Have you had prior contact since your discharge? No. She meant it. And then, 2 seconds later, with the unpleasant sensation of something previously invisible becoming clear. But I saw something during the second deployment, a briefing I wasn't supposed to be in. I was there because there was a medical situation with one of the personnel, and I'd been called in to evaluate. She stopped. Carver was presenting. The briefing was about asset management in a way that I understood after the fact wasn't standard. The kind of asset management that doesn't appear in the official record. The room was very quiet. You were a potential witness, Swick said. I was a potential witness who no one had any reason to pay attention to,
because I was a corpsman on a support role and I wasn't supposed to be in that room. Mara looked at the table. I've spent 3 years not thinking about that briefing, not because I was told not to, because I made the judgment that what I'd seen wasn't clear enough to act on, and that acting on something unclear from a classified context without solid ground would do more damage than it resolved.
But Carver didn't know that, Rafferty said. He didn't know you'd made that judgment. No, he knew I'd been in the room. He didn't know what I'd done with it. So he arranged for you to be in a position where you couldn't do anything with it, Swick said. He placed you in a controlled environment under a director who had leverage, where raising your head would expose your background, and where your background could be used to discredit or silence you. Mara said nothing because Swick had said it correctly and there was nothing to add. The weight of it sat in the room, not dramatic weight, the specific grinding weight of a thing that has been true for 18 months without your knowledge. She'd been managed, placed. She'd thought she was making a choice, leaving the service and finding a quiet ER in a mid-sized Colorado city, and the choice had been partly real and partly a channel that someone had dug for her. She thought about 8 months of keeping her head down, of telling herself it was wisdom. Her jaw was tight. She made herself loosen it. "What do you need from me?" she said to Swick. "To go after Carver." What Swick needed took the better part of 2 hours to begin to collect. It involved Mara giving a formal statement about the briefing, the date, the location, the content she'd observed, framed within the boundaries of what she could discuss with Swick's clearance level and what would require escalation to someone higher. Swick was efficient at this, moving quickly through what could be documented now and flagging what needed to go upward without getting mired in the hierarchy of it. She'd clearly done cross-jurisdictional work before. She didn't push past the clearance walls. She mapped them precisely and moved around them. While this was happening in the conference room, the rest of the building continued its accounting. Marcus Teller arrived at 4:17 p.m. and was met by Holt in the lobby. He was a trim man in his early 50s with the slightly over-careful posture of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just put it down. He had a laptop bag and a physical accordion folder so full that the elastic band holding it shut had left an impression in the cardboard. He handed the folder to Holt and then stood in the lobby looking at the walls with an expression that Deborah Stills, watching from the nursing station, later described as someone exhaling after holding their breath underwater for 8 months. The folder contained billing adjustment records, internal communications, and a documented log of protocol changes that Teller had maintained contemporaneously, meaning he'd written things down as they happened, not reconstructed them later. It included 3 email chains in which Fitch had explicitly directed billing practices that Teller had flagged as non-compliant, along with Fitch's written responses telling him to resubmit the documentation with corrected language. Not correct the practices, correct the language describing them. Holt went through this first third of it in 20 minutes, and then called Swick out of the conference room to show her something on page 47, and Swick read it, looked at Holt, and said, "Get the second warrant ready," which Holt was already doing. Dr. Core's documents arrived with him at 4:40 in a manila folder that he handed to Rafferty with the careful steadiness of someone delivering something fragile. Inside were copies of 2 written concerns he'd filed through the hospital's compliance system, the system's automated responses acknowledging receipt, and then, 14 weeks later, in both cases, the performance review documentation that had appeared in his file. The correlation was exact. 6 weeks of normal reviews before each complaint, negative review within 14 weeks after. The pattern, laid against the timeline of Teller's communications and Greer's administrative records, formed something that was no longer circumstantial. Rafferty spread the documents across the nursing station counter and stood looking at them for a while. Deborah came over and stood next to him. She pointed at a date on one of Core's complaints. "That was a week before Priya's performance improvement plan started," she said. Rafferty looked at the date, looked at the file. "He ran it as a system," he said. "He ran it as a system," she confirmed. At 5:15, Gerald Fitch was formally placed under arrest. It happened in the conference room, without drama and without an audience, which was both procedurally appropriate and, Mara suspected, exactly how Fitch had hoped it would go if this moment was always going to arrive. He'd been banking on managed consequences. Quiet accounting. The kind of thing that gets handled in rooms, not corridors. The part he hadn't anticipated, couldn't have by that point, was Sylvia Greer, Greer had spent 2 hours in the administrative conference suite on the third floor with one of Swick's agents and her own private attorney, who had arrived at 5 p.m. and had assessed the situation in approximately 7 minutes, and advised her client with the blunt efficiency of someone who understood that the value of cooperation diminishes rapidly with time. Greer had listened, and then she had produced, from a cloud backup that she accessed on the agent's tablet with her own credentials, 47 documents that she had been maintaining in a private archive for the last 14 months, not to protect herself. She'd said that to Mara on the loading dock, and it was true in the way that complicated things are true. She'd kept them because she'd known, and keeping records was the only way she'd found to hold herself accountable for the knowing without acting on it. It was a moral compromise that had its own internal logic and its own failure, and Greer appeared to understand both things clearly as she sat in the conference suite clicking through file after file, her face composed and tired in equal measure. The documents included, critically, a series of communications between Btch and a healthcare consulting firm that did not appear in any of Hargrove's official vendor records. The consulting firm's registration was in Delaware. Its primary listed contact was Dorian Marsh, and one of the document attachments, buried in an email chain about quarterly billing reviews, was a PDF that bore the formatting and classification headers of a federal personnel document. The agent who found it called Swick immediately. Swick looked at it, looked at the agent, looked at Greer. "Did you read this document?" "Yes," Greer said. "Did you understand what it was?" "I understood it was someone's military record," Greer said. "I didn't understand why it was in a billing email chain. I kept it because I didn't know what to do with it, and I knew it shouldn't exist in this context." The PDF was not Mara's full-service record. It was a summary, 15 pages, covering her deployment history, her field designations, and a single highlighted section on the second deployment with a notation in the margin that was not in military formatting. The notation was handwritten, scanned. It read, "Present at Carver, /Delacroix, briefing, March 14th. Status, unvetted. Recommend containment." Containment. The word was clinical and euphemistic in the specific way of intelligence work, and Swick knew exactly what it meant, and when she walked back into the conference room at 5:40 and set a printed copy of that page in front of Mara without speaking, Mara looked at it for 10 seconds and then looked up. "Delacroix," she said. "Does that name mean something to you?" "There was a man in the briefing. He wasn't in uniform. I didn't know his name." She looked at the word containment in the margin. Someone's handwriting. Angular. Fast. "What's his full name?" "That's what we're finding out." It was 6 p.m. when Rafferty found her in the corridor near the stairwell, standing with her back against the wall and her arms crossed and her eyes on the middle distance. He didn't say anything at first. He stood beside her and looked at the same patch of middle distance. "How are you doing?" he said finally. "I'm working on that question." He nodded. They stood in silence for a moment. "You know what bothers me most," she said. It wasn't a question. Not that he used the record, not even that he placed me here deliberately. She paused. "What bothers me is that it worked. For 8 months I did exactly what he needed me to do. I saw things, and I assessed them, and I made the judgment to stay quiet. And I thought I was being smart. I thought I was protecting myself." She stopped. "I was doing his job for him." "You were also doing your job," Rafferty said. 8 months of good clinical work. That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "But it's not nothing." She looked at him. He had the qualities she'd noticed from the beginning. He didn't make things more comfortable than they were, but he didn't make them harder than they had to be either. There was something honest in that economy. Walter knew Carver was out there, she said. Not specifically. He couldn't have known specifically. But he knew there was a reason someone capable was sitting in a parking lot instead of somewhere else. She looked at the wall. "That's why he called you." "Walter's had 31 years to learn when something's wrong, even when he can't name what it is," Rafferty said. "He walks into a place, he reads it. He read you in 9 minutes, and he read this hospital, in the time it took to wait for the bleeding to slow." He paused. "He's usually right." "Does he do this often? Walk into emergency rooms bleeding?" The corner of Rafferty's mouth moved almost imperceptibly. Not intentionally. He has a talent for being in the right wrong place at the right wrong time. What was he doing in Denton Falls?
Visiting someone, Rafferty paused. A former member of his unit lives here now. Walter comes through every few months. He looked at her. He wasn't looking for anything when he got hurt, but when he found what he found, he called you. He called me. She thought about that. The specific shape of it, an old veteran bleeding in a parking lot who happened to find a nurse whose history he could read in the sequence of her hands and made a call. Not a heroic intervention, just a man who'd spent 31 years learning to recognize when something was worth acting on. He's going to be all right, she said. The arm. He's had worse. I know, I read it in the wound. Rafferty looked at her briefly, and in the look was the acknowledgement that they were, both of them, people who read things in wounds. Holt came through the stairwell door with her tablet and the expression of someone delivering information she's not sure how to frame. Delacroix, she said. Both of them looked at her. Full name Victor Delacroix, formerly with the Defense Intelligence Agency. He separated from federal service 14 months ago. She looked at her tablet. He's currently a private contractor. His firm provides, in their words, strategic compliance consulting for healthcare and government-adjacent industries. Mara said, the same industry as Marsh. Different firm, they're not publicly connected. Holt paused. But Teller's documents, the billing email chain. There's a CC on one of the Marsh communications that goes to a personal email address. We traced it. The address resolves to a domain registered to a holding company. She looked up from the tablet. Delacroix is listed as the managing partner of the holding company. The three of them stood in the corridor. It's not a hospital story, Rafferty said quietly, almost to himself. The same words Mara had said in this corridor 2 hours ago. It's not close to a hospital story, Holt said. Swick requisitioned the third-floor conference suite as a secondary operations room at 6:50. By 6:30, it looked like a different kind of space entirely. Laptop screens, federal documentation, a whiteboard that one of the agents had started filling in with names and connection lines that would have looked conspiratorial if the connections weren't, at this point, documented. Mara was in the room. She'd been placed there deliberately, not as a subject, but as a resource. She was the one person present who had direct contextual knowledge of the operational world that Carver and Delacroix had come from, and Swick used her efficiently. She didn't ask Mara to speculate. She asked her to confirm or deny specific details as they emerged, to identify what was plausible given her knowledge of how that world operated, and to flag anything that didn't fit. It was, Mara recognized, the same role she'd played in a different context for a long time, the one who had the complete picture. The one the situation turned on. She was also exhausted, cold, and still in wet scrubs, and at some point a junior agent who looked barely old enough to have graduated training had appeared at her elbow with a dry hospital blanket and a cup of coffee without being asked, and she'd accepted both with something between gratitude and the slight self-consciousness of someone unaccustomed to being looked after. She was working through the third coffee when Marcus Teller appeared in the conference suite doorway and asked if he could speak with her directly. She looked at Swick, who nodded. She stepped out into the corridor with Teller. He stood across from her with his hands in his jacket pockets and the look of a man who has said most of what he needed to say and has one thing remaining. When I left, he said, I told myself it was because of my health, the stress of the job. He looked at the wall. That was partly true. But mostly I left because Fitch made it clear that if I kept pushing on the billing discrepancies, the same thing that happened to Priya and Dr. Kaur would happen to me. He stopped. I had a folder full of documentation and I left anyway. You kept the folder, she said. For 8 months I kept it in a drawer and told myself it wasn't enough, that no one would act on it, that the institution would protect itself and I'd just be another person who'd gotten ground up trying to push against something too large. He looked at her. I watched you walk out of this building today on the security feed. Someone showed me the still frame later. Your face. He shook his head. I thought, if she can do that, stand there like that, then I can make a phone call. She didn't know what to say to that exactly. It was the kind of thing that didn't fit neatly into any response she had available. You did the right thing, she said, which was true and insufficient in equal measure. I should have done it 8 months ago. He said it simply, without self-pity. I just wanted you to know that you walking out of here this afternoon is what made me pick up the phone. She held that. Thank you for telling me, she said. He
He nodded and went back to where Holt was waiting to go through more of his documentation. Mara stood in the corridor alone for a moment. She thought about the security footage still, her face at the moment of impact, expression unchanged. She'd been told about it, but hadn't seen it herself. She hadn't sought it out. The idea of it was strange to her, the idea that a moment she'd lived from the inside, absorbing, adjusting, moving on, had been visible to anyone looking, that it had been seen, and that the seeing had mattered to someone enough to change what they did. She went back into the conference suite. At 7 p.m., Swick received a call that she took standing at the window of the conference suite, and the call lasted 4 minutes. And when she ended it, her expression had shifted in the specific way of someone who has just received confirmation of something they were hoping to be wrong about. She turned to the room. "The second warrant has been approved," she said, "for Dorian Marsh and for the holding company linked to Delacroix." She looked at Rafferty. "We also have a flag from Naval Intelligence. Carver has been located. He's in Denver." She paused. "He knows we've been at Hargrove today. Someone notified him." The room went still. "Someone in this building," Rafferty said. "Unknown yet. The notification came through an encrypted channel, but the timing is consistent with this afternoon's activity." Swick looked at her agents. "Carver has not yet been approached. We're working on jurisdiction and whether to move tonight or—" "Tonight," Mara said. Swick looked at her. "If he knows you were here and he knows why," Mara said, "then he's already making calls. He's been in intelligence long enough to know the window. If you wait until tomorrow morning, the window is gone." "I agree with the assessment," Rafferty said, "but the authorization for—" "is being processed," Swick said. "I know, I'm pushing it." She looked at Mara. "In the meantime, the briefing you described, the Carver/Delacroix meeting, we need everything you remember. Not just the highlights, the full detail. Who was in the room, what was said, the specific language." "I told you most of it." "Tell me the rest." Mara looked at her. "How much of this is usable given the classification level?" "More of it than you'd expect. The OIG has cross-departmental authority that extends into certain areas that most people don't realize." Swick stopped. "Trust me that I can take more than you think." Mara considered this for a moment, looked at Rafferty, who gave her nothing specific, just the look of someone who'd assessed Swick over the course of a very long afternoon and found the assessment favorable. She pulled a chair up to the table, sat down, and she started from the beginning. Not the version she'd been carrying for 3 years, the abbreviated, careful version she'd built to satisfy the part of her that needed the experience to be manageable. The actual beginning. The hallway she hadn't been supposed to be in, the medical call that put her there, the door that was open 3 inches, the voices inside. She talked for 37 minutes. Swick listened without interrupting. Her agent took notes. Rafferty stood at the wall and listened. Holt, who had come back from the floor at some point and taken up a position near the door, listened. When Mara finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "Delacroix," Swick said. "In the briefing, you said he referenced procurement channels." "He used the word procurement. The context was personnel." She stopped. "Not goods. People." "You understood it to mean the recruitment or placement of individuals." "I understood it to mean placing people in positions where they could be managed, where they were useful or controllable, or both." She paused. "At the time, I thought I was misreading the context. I was in the room for 12 minutes, and I was focused on the medical situation that had brought me there." She looked at the table. "I was not misreading it." "No," Swick said. "You weren't." An agent at the far end of the room said, "Ma'am," to Swick, and held up a tablet. Swick crossed the room and looked at it. The expression change was small, controlled, but Mara had been reading faces under pressure for long enough to catch it. "What happened?" Rafferty said. Swick turned from the tablet. "Carver's hotel room in Denver. He checked out 20 minutes ago." She looked at the agent. "Get me the authorization for the vehicle." "He's running," Rafferty said. "He's trying to." She was already moving toward the door. "But 20 minutes is not very long." She stopped at the door, looked at Mara. "I need you to stay in this building," she said. "I understand." "I mean it. Not in the parking lot, not in the service corridor. In this building." The look she gave Mara was not unkind, but it was absolutely direct. "Carver knows you're here. He may know more than that.
Until we have him, you're a loose end he's aware of. The word loose end landed in the room with its full weight. Rafferty said, I'll stay. Swick looked at him for half a second, made a decision, nodded, and left with 3 of her agents. The conference suite went quiet. One agent remained at the far end, working. Holt was on her tablet. Teller was on the 3rd floor going through documents with another agent. Somewhere downstairs, Walter was still in the lobby. Mara was looking at the whiteboard. Carver's name was on it, connected to Marsh, connected to Delacroix, connected to Hargrove, connected to Fitch, connected by a line that had her name at the other end. The architecture of 18 months of someone else's planning, laid out in dry erase marker on a 3rd floor whiteboard in a hospital building in Colorado. He placed you here, Rafferty said from the wall. He built the whole thing, and then you walked into a bay and treated a veteran, and it unraveled in a single afternoon. Walter unraveled it, she said. You treated him. He was bleeding. Rafferty said, Elston. Something in his voice made her look. For what it's worth. In 12 years of operational work, I have never seen anyone manage what you manage today. The statements, Greer on the loading dock, Drummond's room, the teller call. Under these circumstances. Without authority, without credentials, in wet scrubs. She looked at him. I don't know what you're going to do when this is over, he said. But whatever it is, it shouldn't be an anonymous ER in a mid-sized city. She was quiet for a moment. I liked the work, she said. It was simple and true. I liked having a patient in front of me and a clear problem and my hands doing the thing they know how to do. That's not incompatible with what I'm saying. She looked at the whiteboard, at her name in the bottom right corner of someone else's diagram. She was about to say something when Holt looked up sharply from her tablet. Ma'am, Holt said to the agent at the far end. He looked at her screen. His face changed. Rafferty crossed the room in 4 steps, looked at the tablet. Mara came to his shoulder. On the screen was a security camera feed. Exterior, the building's north side. The service road off the loading dock. The timestamp was current. The image was grainy in the dark, and the rain, which had resumed at some point in the last hour, but the shape of it was clear enough. A vehicle, parked on the service road with its lights off. A sedan, dark-colored, and standing next to it, talking to someone through the driver's window, was a figure in a hospital maintenance uniform. The agent pulled up the building's staff manifest on the adjacent screen and ran a search on maintenance personnel currently logged as on shift. The figure in the footage was not on the list. Rafferty said, That's how Carver got the notification. He was already moving toward the door. Someone in this building is still in contact with him. Mara was right behind him. Elston, he said without turning. Stay in this. Someone in this building, she said, knows the layout, the stairwells, the access points, the exact location of every federal agent on site right now. You don't know this building. She stopped just behind him in the doorway. I do. He turned and looked at her. 3 seconds. Stay with me, he said. They went to the stairs. The service stairwell was cold and badly lit and smelled of the cleaning products that maintenance stored on the landing between floors. They went down fast, Rafferty first, Mara 1 step behind, moving quietly in a way that had nothing civilian in it. At the ground floor landing, she put a hand on Rafferty's arm before he pushed the door, and he stopped, and she pointed at the gap under the door where the light from the corridor came through. Shadow. Moving. Someone on the other side. Rafferty shifted his hand position on the door handle. Mara pressed against the wall to the right of the door frame. He opened the door fast and low. The figure on the other side had time to pull back 1 step and no more. Rafferty had him against the corridor wall inside 4 seconds. Not violent, efficient, the kind of physical control that comes from doing this in worse lighting, in worse places. The man was 30, maintenance uniform, a phone in his hand that clattered to the floor when Rafferty's forearm pressed his into the wall. The phone's screen was lit, a text thread. The most recent message, sent 40 seconds ago, read, "She's on 3. Federal count is 6 on site." Rafferty stayed. Mara looked at the phone, looked at the man. He was young, not hard, not professional. He had the look of someone who had been paid to do something and had only just arrived at the reality of what that something was. "Who are you in contact with?" she said. He looked at her. His eyes went to the mark on her cheek. She let him look. "The number," she said. "Who does it belong to?" He closed his eyes. Marsh, he said. Not Carver. Marsh. Which meant the information chain was this man to Marsh to Carver. And if Carver had checked out of his hotel 20 minutes ago with a notification from this building, the chain had been running all day. Rafferty had his phone out, passing the information upward before the man had finished speaking. Mara crouched and picked up the phone from the floor without touching the screen, held it so the last message was visible, read back through the thread. 6 messages, the oldest time stamped at 2:17 p.m. 2:17. She'd been in the conference room at 2:17 watching Fitch's attorney walk in the door and running through the structure of the billing investigation with Holt. 6 messages. 6 points of real-time intelligence fed out of this building over the course of the afternoon. She scrolled to the oldest message and read it. Her own name. Her own name in the oldest message, time-stamped 1 hour after she'd walked back into the hospital, sent to Marsh by someone who had been watching the parking lot and had seen her come back in beside Rafferty. Someone had flagged her return in real time. Someone who'd been positioned to see it. She thought about the lobby at 2 p.m., the people in it, the positions. She stood up. Rafferty, she said. The person who sent the first message. They were in the lobby at approximately 1 p.m. She looked at him. They could see the parking lot from where they were standing. Rafferty looked at her with the quick focus of someone who needs 2 more pieces to complete a picture. The lobby, she said. Who was in the lobby at 1 p.m., who had a direct view of the parking lot entrance, and who had any reason to know who I was? The agent who had followed them down from the 3rd floor at some point in the last 30 seconds said, "The front desk logged," and stopped. Mara looked at him. "The front desk logged a visitor sign-in at 12:50, he said. Non-staff, signed in as healthcare consultant. Name on the log is..." He checked his tablet. "Marsh," he said. Dorian Marsh had been in this building. He had been in this building when Rafferty arrived, when the federal agents came through the front door, when Mara walked back in from the parking lot. He had watched all of it from the lobby, or from wherever he'd positioned himself after signing in, and he had been feeding it outward in real time. And he had signed in under his own name because the alternative was a false identity on a federal building's log, which was a different category of problem than anything else he'd done today, which meant he'd made a calculation, that today was going to be manageable, that the network was solid enough. The calculation had been wrong. "He's still here," Mara said. Rafferty looked at her. "He signed in," she said. "He didn't sign out. I watched the front desk all afternoon. They log exit times after federal personnel arrived. He didn't sign out." Rafferty was on the phone. Mara was already moving toward the lobby. The maintenance man was against the wall with Rafferty's agent behind him, and the phone was evidence, and the thread was leading somewhere specific. But Marsh was in this building right now, and he knew the federal count was 6, and he'd been calculating all afternoon, and at some point in the last 20 minutes, he'd found out that Carver's hotel room was empty. She came through the stairwell door into the ground floor corridor and walked fast toward the lobby. The lobby was lower light now. Evening, the overhead fluorescents on, the rain-dark windows showing nothing but reflections. 3 federal agents visible, the front desk staffer, 2 remaining hospital staff. Walter Pruitt still near the window, in his wheelchair, with the dry blanket across his lap. And across the lobby, near the corridor that led to the administrative wing, the corridor that nobody had been using since Swick had set up operations on 3. A man in a dark jacket was standing with his phone in his hand and his body turned slightly toward the fire exit. He hadn't seen her yet. She walked toward him. Not fast enough to alarm, not slow enough to waste the seconds she had before he looked up. She crossed the lobby in 12 steps, and she was 6 feet from him when he registered motion and lifted his eyes from his phone, and they looked at each other. He was 50, heavy-set, with the careful grooming of someone who spent a lot of time presenting well and the eyes of someone who had long practice at assessing exits. He looked at her face, at the mark on her cheek, at the fact that she was moving toward him with her chin level and her hands loose at her sides. She watched him make the calculation. She watched him decide. He moved for the fire exit. She was already there, not blocking it. She was standing to the right of it, and when he came through the push bar, she was behind him on the landing, before the door finished its arc, and she had his right wrist at an angle that stopped him without breaking anything, pressing him against the railing with his phone dropping past the railing into the stairwell below, with a 3-floor clatter. "Dorian Marsh," she said. He was breathing hard. She was not. "You're hurting." "I'm not," she said. "But I can." She leaned close enough that he could hear her clearly without her raising her voice. "The threat is already in federal hands. The vehicle on the service road is already flagged. Carver checked out of his hotel, and your people are already looking for him." She paused. "There is no version of this where you walk out of here tonight. The only decision you have left is what condition you're in when you don't." Below them in the stairwell, running footsteps. Rafferty came through the fire door 2 steps behind her, took the situation in a single look, and had Marsh's other arm. Marsh stopped fighting. In the lobby, through the fire door glass, Mara could see Walter Pruitt at his window, turned toward the fire exit, watching. His expression was unreadable in the reflection-dark glass. But he was watching. Rafferty said into his phone, "Marsh is secure. North stairwell. Ground floor. Send 2. He looked at Mara. She released Marsh's wrist and stepped back. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was measured. 8 months of quiet, of keeping her head down, of doing exactly what someone had needed her to do. And it ended on a fire stairwell landing with a man who had spent half a year treating her as a controlled variable going still under her hands. She became aware that Rafferty was looking at her with an expression that was not quite professional. "You knew where he was," he said. "I watched the lobby all afternoon," she said. "I knew who was in it." He looked at her for a moment longer than the situation required. Downstairs, 2 agents came through the base of the stairwell and started up. Mara looked at Marsh. He was looking at the floor with the expression of someone who has finally stopped calculating because the numbers have stopped working. "Who contacted you?" she said. "When Swick's request went in for the footage, who told you to notify Carver?" He said nothing. "The notification went out at 2:17, she said. "That was before the formal warrant, before most of the staff even understood what was happening." She looked at him steadily. "Whoever told you was inside the investigation's information chain. That's not a low-level contact." He looked up at her. Something moved through his face. Not cooperation, not yet, but the specific quality of someone who is beginning to understand that the thing they've been protecting is no longer worth protecting. "You were the containment," he said. It was almost wondering. "That's all you were supposed to be. A problem that was managed before it became a problem." He looked at the mark on her cheek as he said it, which struck her as either completely unconscious or precisely deliberate, and she couldn't tell which. 6 months ago, if someone had told me a routine ER nurse was going to be the thing that— "I'm not a routine ER nurse," she said. He held her gaze. "No," he said slowly. "I can see that now." The 2 agents reached the landing and Rafferty stepped aside. As they moved Marsh toward the door, he said over his shoulder, without looking back, "Carver didn't run, Ms. Elston. He's coming back." The door closed behind them. Rafferty looked at Mara. The stairwell was quiet. "He's coming back," Rafferty said. "He's coming back because Marsh just told him the federal count," she said. 6 agents, 1 commander, and he knows I'm here." She looked at the closed door. He's not running. He never was. He's repositioning." "For what?" She looked at Rafferty. "For me," she said. Rafferty didn't waste time arguing with the assessment. He got on his phone while they were still on the stairwell landing, and Mara listened to him relay the information upward with the efficient precision of someone who has had to convey urgent intelligence in conditions that did not allow for misunderstanding. He used clipped, specific language: Carver's name, the hotel checkout time, Marsh's statement, the implication of repositioning rather than flight, and the person on the other end of the call was clearly someone who could act on it, because Rafferty's posture shifted slightly as he listened to the response. The way posture shifts when the situation acquires institutional weight. He ended the call and looked at her. "Naval Intelligence is coordinating with the Denver field office," he said. "They're tracking Carver's vehicle from the hotel. He's heading north. North is toward Denton Falls." "Yes." "How long?" "At current speed, 40 minutes, maybe 35. She thought about the building, about the 6 federal agents now spread across 3 floors, about the service road on the north side where a car had been parked with its lights off, about the fact that Carver had spent 14 months building a structure designed to contain her, and that the structure had collapsed in an afternoon, and that a man who operated in intelligence didn't let that kind of loss go without trying to reclaim something from it. "He's not coming to threaten me," she said.
He's coming to talk, to offer something. Rafferty looked at her steadily. What does he have to offer? My full service record is still classified. The deployment details, the specific operations, the personnel involved. There are things in that record that I don't want in open court, that I can't want in open court without it affecting people who aren't part of this. She paused. He knows that. He's always known that. The containment was built on it. She looked at her hands. He's going to come in and tell me that if I step back, if I limit what I tell Swick, if I pull my testimony about the briefing, he can make the record stay buried. He's going to call it a trade. And if you don't take it, then he uses whatever access he still has to surface the parts of that record that are hardest to explain out of context. She said it without heat, which was harder than it would have been an hour ago. There are things I did in that deployment that were necessary and that I'd do again, and that look in a document with no surrounding context, like something else entirely. Rafferty was quiet for a moment. You knew this was the play, he said, when Marsh said Carver wasn't running. I've had 40 minutes to know it. She looked at the door. He's been in this business long enough to understand that leverage works both ways. He leaned on my record to keep me quiet for 8 months. If that stopped working today, he'll try to use it one more time. What do you want to do? She held the question. Not because she didn't know the answer. She'd known it, she realized, since she sat down in the conference room and started talking to Swick and found that she couldn't stop. That the accumulated weight of 3 years of careful containment had a momentum of its own once it started moving. I want to be in the room when he comes in, she said. Rafferty looked at her for a long moment. Swick's people will handle the approach, he said. If he comes in voluntarily, he comes in and talks. If he doesn't, he'll come in voluntarily. She was certain of this. He's calculated the risk. He thinks the offer works. He's not going to show up with a weapon to a building full of federal agents. That's not who he is. He's someone who uses information the way other people use force. She paused. He's going to walk through the front door and ask to speak with whoever's in charge. And then you want him to walk in. I want him to see me walk in, she said. Swick returned to the building at 7:58 p.m., 11 minutes before Carver's vehicle appeared on the service road camera that the agents had kept monitored since finding the maintenance man in the corridor. She came in through the main entrance with 2 of her agents and the particular kinetic quality of someone who has been moving fast for a while and has not yet stopped. Rafferty met her in the lobby. Mara was with him. Swick took the updated situation in, assessed it, and looked at Mara. You think he comes in voluntary? Yes. And you think his play is a negotiated silence on your testimony? He has nothing else. Swick looked at Rafferty. An exchange passed between them that Mara was not quite part of. Not exclusionary, just fast. The kind of communication that happens between people who have worked in high-stakes official contexts long enough to compress agreement into 2 seconds. There's a room off the administrative corridor, Swick said to Mara. You'll be in it. Audio only. Why, we're not doing this as an interview. We're doing it as a voluntary conversation that I happen to be recording. If he lawyers up, the recording stops. If he tries to make the offer, she stopped. I need you to understand that whatever he says about your service record, the OIG's position, is that the classification status of your deployment is a separate matter from this investigation, and that nothing you've told me today will be used in a context that requires declassification of those operational details. You can promise that, Mara said. I can promise that I don't have the authority to declassify, and that I'm not going to chase something that would require me to try. Swick held her gaze. What you saw in that briefing is useful context for understanding why Carver set up this structure. It's not the case. The case is the billing fraud, the assault, the illegal use of your personnel record, and Carver's role in establishing the containment arrangement. That's enough. Mara held this, testing it against what she knew about how these things worked. Swick was not making a promise she couldn't keep. She was drawing a boundary around her own jurisdiction, which was a different thing, more honest, more durable. All right, Mara said. The room has a window into the corridor. You'll see him when he comes in. Swick looked at her watch. Estimated arrival? Based on current tracking, 12 minutes, Rafferty said. Then let's get positioned. The room off the administrative corridor had been a small meeting space before today, and now it had 2 federal agents in it, and a laptop running audio from the corridor's ambient system, and a window that gave a clear sight line to the lobby entrance. Mara stood at the window with her arms crossed and her shoulder against the wall and watched the lobby. Walter was still there. Nobody had told him to leave and he hadn't offered to go. And at this point, his presence had become simply part of the room's architecture. He was at his window, the one he'd claimed 3 hours ago when someone helped him back inside from the rain. His blanket was still across his lap. He looked, from this distance, like a man who had decided to wait something out and was prepared to wait as long as it took. Mara looked at him through the glass. She thought about 9 minutes in a bay, about the sequence of her own hands doing what they knew how to do, while an old man watched with the specific attention of someone who understands what they're seeing. She thought about the parking lot, the concrete barrier, the rain. The moment she'd heard the helicopter and looked up, she'd thought in that first moment that Walter was the story, that she was the incidental character, the nurse who'd treated him, pulled into his orbit, circumstantially adjacent to whatever his history had put in motion. It had taken most of the afternoon for her to understand that she'd had it backward. Walter's bleeding arm, his calm, his phone call, all of it had been in service of something he'd read in under 9 minutes in a hospital bay. He'd looked at her hands and made a call. The story wasn't his. It had always been hers. She just hadn't known it. At 8:11 p.m., a dark sedan pulled into the Hargrove Medical Center front lot. Elliot Carver got out of the vehicle alone. He was 52, she knew from the record Swick had shown her. He looked it, fit in the careful way of someone who had maintained physical readiness as a professional habit long after it stopped being required, with the kind of face that told you very little by design. He was dressed in civilian clothes, dark jacket, no visible identification. He stood beside his car for a moment and looked at the building's front entrance with the assessing gaze of someone reading a room before entering it. He saw the federal vehicles. He saw the agent stationed near the entrance. He looked at all of it for 5 full seconds. Then he walked to the front door. Mara heard his voice through the audio before she saw him in the corridor. "My name is Elliot Carver. I'm here voluntarily. I'd like to speak with whoever's running this operation." The front desk agent said something. A pause. Then Swick's voice. "Commander Carver, this way." Carver's footsteps in the corridor were even, not hurried. He'd made the calculation she'd predicted and he was committed to it, walking it straight into whatever room he'd decided was the one worth being in. He passed the window. She was standing back enough that he wouldn't see her unless he looked directly at the window and knew to look. He didn't. He was looking forward, toward the conference room door that Swick had pulled open at the far end of the corridor. But Walter, visible in the lobby beyond the corridor entrance, was watching Carver pass. And in watching him, Walter's gaze traveled along the corridor and found Mara's window. He couldn't see her face at this distance in this light, but he nodded. She wasn't sure why that mattered as much as it did. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't permission. It was just a 73-year-old man in a wheelchair in a hospital he'd bled into 12 hours ago, nodding at a window. It mattered anyway. She turned from the window and looked at the audio feed. Carver was smooth. She'd expected smooth, and he delivered it without effort, the practiced fluency of someone who had spent a career in rooms where saying the wrong thing had real consequences. He was cooperative with Swick's preliminary questions, his name, his former role, his current contractor status. He confirmed knowing Marsh. He confirmed his familiarity with Hargrove Medical Center. And then, precisely when Swick's questioning reached the point where the next answer would require him to either commit to a truth or construct a lie that could be documented, he changed direction. "I want to talk about Mara Elston," he said. Swick said, "What about her?" "I understand she's provided testimony regarding a briefing she witnessed during her second deployment. I want to address that directly." A pause. The operational context of that briefing involves classified programs that, if introduced into this investigation's record, would create significant security implications. I'm not here to obstruct. I'm here to suggest that there's a version of resolution that protects the investigation's integrity and prevents an unnecessary security event. What version would that be? Ms. Elston's testimony about the briefing is based on a partial observation. 12 minutes, she said. That's not long enough to have a complete picture of what was being discussed. He said it carefully, without hostility. I'm not saying she's wrong about what she saw. I'm saying the interpretation requires context that the classification level doesn't allow her to provide. He paused. If her testimony is limited to events that occurred within Hargrove Medical Center, the assault,
The employment arrangement, the billing concerns.
this investigation proceeds without complication. The security concerns go away, and I cooperate fully with everything inside this hospital's walls. Swick said, and if her testimony isn't limited, then I have an obligation to protect the programs involved, which means contesting the classification status of her service record in a venue that will make this investigation considerably more complicated. He said it without threat, almost gently, the way people say things they have prepared thoroughly. I'd rather not do that. I don't think anyone benefits from it. Mara heard it all through the audio. She looked at the agent beside her, who was watching the laptop screen with the particular stillness of someone not wanting to affect what they're observing. She pushed open the door of the room and walked into the corridor. She didn't knock. She pushed the conference room door and walked in, and Carver looked up, and for the first time all day she saw something unplanned cross someone's face. He'd known she was in the building. He'd known she'd testified. He had not expected her to walk into the room while he was still in the process of making his offer, and the 2 seconds of visible recalibration that crossed his face were the most honest thing she'd seen from him. She pulled out a chair and sat down across the table from him. Swick didn't stop her. She looked at Carver. He looked at her. "You put me here," she said. It was the whole of what she wanted to say, stated simply, and she let it sit between them. "I recommended a placement," he said carefully, "based on the assessment that you put me in a building run by a man who was committing billing fraud and assaulting his staff, and you handed him my service record as leverage, and you spent 18 months waiting to see if you'd need to use it." She kept her voice level. Not because she wasn't angry. She was, more than she'd let herself feel until this moment, a cold, specific anger with weight and shape to it. But level was more damaging than loud, and she'd known that for a long time. "That's what you did." He looked at her steadily.
I made a risk management decision in a complex. You managed me, she said, like a variable, like something that needed to be kept in a specific position so it couldn't cause problems. She paused. How many other people did you place? How many other service records did you hand to people like Btch with the same instructions? This one can't make noise. Use it. Something in his face shifted. Not much, but something. I want to talk about the briefing, she said, not to you, to the people in this investigation who can act on it. And your offer, the one you just made Swick, is based on the assumption that I care enough about the classification to make a trade. You should care, he said. The operational details in your record. I know what's in my record, she said. I was there. She held his gaze. The things that look difficult without context? I can provide the context. I can sit in front of the appropriate oversight committee with the appropriate clearance in the room and explain every single one of them. That's not comfortable. It's not fast. But it's possible. She paused. You assumed I'd been quiet for 3 years because I was afraid of the record. I was quiet because I made a judgment call that the information wasn't actionable in isolation. Those are different things. The room was very still. Swick was not moving. The agent by the door was not moving. Carver looked at Mara for a long moment with an expression that was doing several things at once, and she watched it and waited. The briefing, he said finally. You understood what you saw. Yes. And you've communicated that understanding. Yes? He leaned back slightly. A micro-movement. The kind that happens when a structure gives way and the body registers it before the mind does. Delacroix, she said. He's the name you're protecting. Not the program, the person. The rest of the classification is cover. She watched him. Where is he? Carver said nothing. He's not in federal service anymore, she said. Swick's already confirmed that. His consulting firm is being traced. His connection to Marsh and to this hospital is documented. She leaned forward slightly. If Delacroix is the person who put the containment idea together, and based on the margin notation I've seen, he is, then you're not protecting a classified program right now. You're protecting a private citizen who's been running intelligence-adjacent operations on civilian institutions. She held his gaze. That's not a classification issue. That's a crime. Something in Carver's face finally settled. Not into defeat, into a different kind of calculation, The one that happens when all the previous calculations have stopped working and you have to start from wherever you actually are. I want an attorney, he said. That's your right, Swick said immediately. And I want to speak with Naval Intelligence directly, not through field channels. That can be arranged. He looked at the table. He looked at Mara one more time. The looking was complicated. She didn't try to decode all of it. Some of it was the professional recognition of someone who misjudged what they were dealing with. Some of it was something older than that. For what it's worth, he said, and then stopped. It's not worth much right now, she said. Not cruelly, just accurately. He nodded. Swick's agent moved to his side. Carver stood without being asked and let himself be directed toward the door. He walked out of the conference room, and Mara looked at the space where he'd been sitting and felt the things she'd been carrying since the parking lot, the specific weight of 18 months of someone else's architecture imposed on her life, go somewhere outside her body, not disappear. It would take longer than tonight for it to fully work through. But it moved. It shifted from her shoulders to the room, and she was no longer the one holding it. Swick sat down across from her. Delacroix, Swick said. He'll surface, Mara said. Carver asking for Naval Intelligence directly is him trying to control the narrative before it comes out. He's going to trade Delacroix's location for whatever he can get. She looked at Swick. Let him. That's exactly what we're going to do. Swick looked at her steadily. You should know. The oversight committee process you described. For the classification review. You're not going to have to do it alone. The OIG's office has a liaison function specifically for... I know, Mara said. I know the process. I'll use it. Swick looked at her for a moment. Not the professional assessment look she'd been using all evening. Something more direct than that. You've been doing this for 12 hours, she said. Without credentials, without authority, with someone else's handprint on your face. You should know that everything that moved today moved because of the groundwork you laid in the first 2 hours. She paused. That's not a small thing. Walter made the call, Mara said. Walter made one call, Swick said. You did the rest. Gerald Fitch was formally processed at 8:47 p.m. in the Hargrove Medical Center conference room, under arrest for assault causing bodily harm and a preliminary count of healthcare fraud conspiracy, with additional charges to follow as Teller's documentation was processed. The formal processing was not dramatic. It rarely is. A man who had built 9 years of institutional authority sat in a chair and had his rights read to him by an agent half his age, and the authority he'd spent those 9 years constructing had no physical presence in the room. It had already gone. His attorney was present. She had spent the last 3 hours reviewing the accumulated evidence and had arrived at the accurate understanding that her role was now management of consequences rather than prevention of them. She was very good at her job, which meant she understood precisely when the job had changed. Sylvia Greer, who had spent 4 hours in the third-floor conference suite working methodically through the implications of her own cooperation, was not arrested that evening. The determination of her precise role in the fraud structure was ongoing, and Swick had made the practical calculation that Greer's continued cooperation was worth more than an immediate arrest. Greer understood this, and she understood what it required of her, and she continued cooperating with the focused thoroughness of someone who has decided that doing a thing well is the only thing left to control. Dr. Kaur, at 9 p.m., was sitting at the nursing station writing the most detailed clinical notes of his career, covering every observation he'd made over the past 14 months that he'd previously kept only in personal documentation. Deborah Stills was next to him, doing the same thing. They were not talking much. They didn't need to. The work had a quality to it, urgent but settled, the way work feels when it finally aligns with what it was supposed to be. Ronnie, the transport aide, had gone home at 8 with a formal witness statement in the file and the particular look of someone who had done something that surprised them and was going to need a little time to finish being surprised. Ellis Drummond in room 12 had been visited by a hospital administrator, not Fitch's administrator, a different one, someone Swick had identified as genuinely uninvolved in the fraud structure, who sat with him for 20 minutes and explained, in plain language, exactly what his coverage situation was, and exactly what the hospital was going to do about it. His room temperature had been corrected at 6 p.m. He'd had dinner. He'd told the administrator, when asked how he was feeling, better than I was this morning, which was both a medical report and something larger than that. But does he...
Mara found Walter at 9:15 when most of the active movement in the building had quieted into ongoing procedure. He was still at his window. The rain had stopped sometime in the last hour, and the parking lot was full of official vehicles, and the sky above the mountains, visible now that the weather had shifted, had gone to a deep clear dark with the first stars coming through. She sat in the chair beside him. They looked at the parking lot for a while. "Carver's in custody," she said. "I heard. His attorney arrived 20 minutes ago. Naval Intelligence Liaison is on the phone with Swick. It's going to take a long time to work through all of it." "It usually does." She looked at his arm. The compression bandage was still in place, the IV long since discontinued. He'd need proper follow-up, imaging to confirm no structural damage, the long, quiet work of healing that didn't have the urgency of the initial treatment but mattered just as much. "You need to see someone about that arm tomorrow," she said. "I know." "Properly, not someone who treats you for 20 minutes in a bay while everything else is happening." "I'll make an appointment," he said. "I know a good nurse." She looked at him. "Is that a joke?" she said. "It's a statement of fact." She looked back at the window. At the parking lot where his helicopter sat, rotors still, waiting. "Why Denton Falls?" she said. "You could have surfaced this from anywhere. You could have called Rafferty from your car in the parking lot." "I could have," he agreed. "But you came inside. You were the one who knew what you were looking at," he said. "I knew that before you opened your mouth. The way you assessed the wound, you'd seen worse and treated worse, and you were handling it the way you handle something that's serious but manageable." He paused. "Someone who's been through the kind of thing you've been through and still shows up for the work. That's not ordinary. And the place they're showing up in was not ordinary either. I could feel it when I came in. The way the staff moved around each other. The particular way nobody looked at me when I was clearly someone who needed looking at. Otsmas." She thought about the front desk that morning, the weight of everyone calculating before acting. "I needed to see it directly," Walter said. "Not hear about it, see it." He looked at the lot. "And I needed you to see me see it." She looked at him. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. In the quiet, she could hear the building settling into its quieter version of itself, the reduced frequency sounds of a place that had been put through something significant and was now doing the work of continuing. "Because I've known people who've done what you've done," he said, "in the field and afterward. And the ones who come out of it and go quiet, really quiet, the way you were quiet, sometimes they're quiet because they've found something genuine and they want to protect it. And sometimes they're quiet because someone convinced them the quiet was their only option." He looked at her directly. "I needed to know which one you were." "And which one am I?" "I think you know now," he said. She did. She'd known it somewhere around the second hour of the afternoon, though she'd been too busy to stop and look at it. The quiet she'd built in Denton Falls, the deliberate smallness of the ER life, the careful avoidance of anything that might pull her history back into the room. She'd called it a choice. It had felt like one. But it had been built on someone else's math, someone else's assessment of what she could and couldn't do, and that foundation had been false. The work she'd loved, the clinical precision, the 9-minute wound closure, the IV running while everything else was being decided, that wasn't small. That had never been small. She'd just been standing in a place that was trying to make it small. "Rafferty wants to talk to you," Walter said. "When you're ready, not tonight." "About what?" "About the kind of work that uses the whole of what you are." He paused. "There are units that need people who understand field medicine and civilian systems and the specific way institutional corruption works from the inside. People who can walk into a place and read it in 9 minutes. He looked at her. "You already know how to do it. You've been doing it all day." She sat with that, not with the answer, with the question underneath it. What do you do with a life that's been partially returned to you? How do you pick it back up when you've spent 18 months being carefully managed into not reaching for it? She'd figure out the answer. It wouldn't be tonight. But the question being available to her, being genuinely open rather than foreclosed, was itself something she hadn't fully had since her discharge. "I need a shower," she said, "and dry clothes, and about 8 hours. "In that order, probably," Walter said. "And you need to get that arm looked at tonight, not tomorrow. The imaging should have been done hours ago." "You're not on shift," he said. "I'm a nurse," she said. "I'm always on shift. He made the sound that was almost a laugh, dry, warm, unhurried. She stood up, looked at him. "Walter?" She said it simply, without preamble. "Thank you." He looked up at her. His expression was the same one he'd had in Bay 6 when she'd asked if he needed anything, and he'd said, "I'll be fine." The same settled quality, the same deep patience. But something was different in it now. Not softer, but more present. "You did this," he said. "I made a phone call. You did the rest." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she nodded and walked back toward the corridor and the work of everything that came next. Ned. The formal charges against Gerald Btch were filed 11 days after his arrest. The list was longer than what had been announced the evening of his arrest, because Teller's documentation and Greer's cooperation had opened sections of the billing fraud that the initial warrant hadn't reached. The final count included healthcare fraud conspiracy, assault causing bodily harm, evidence tampering, the false signatures on Arthur Vanek's name, and a charge Swick had flagged on day 3 that nobody had initially anticipated: interference with a federal witness, specifically tied to the arrangement with Carver to place and contain Mara Elston. The healthcare fraud count alone represented 11% of 4,000 patient records over 22 months, which translated to a figure that the investigative journalists who covered the story found genuinely difficult to write without triple-checking it. The initial billing discrepancy estimate of 11% was revised upward to 16% when the full records were processed. The total was substantial enough to trigger a parallel investigation into the regional healthcare network that owned Hargrove Medical Center, a chain that operated 11 other facilities across 3 states. Btch's attorney negotiated. That was her job, and she did it. But the footage, the 7 witness statements, Teller's meticulous documentation, Greer's 47 documents, Ellis Drummond's handwritten notes, and the security camera still frame that had become, through no one's deliberate action, the central image of the case, left very little room to negotiate into. He accepted a plea arrangement that removed the trial but not the consequences. 17 years, reduced to 12, with cooperation on the network-level investigation. He would lose his medical administrator's license permanently. He would pay restitution on the billing fraud that exceeded his personal net worth. He walked out of the conference room on his own feet, which was the last thing he did in that building at that level. Sylvia Greer received a significantly reduced sentence in exchange for her full cooperation and her 47 documents, which turned out to be the most comprehensively organized evidence in the case, the result of 14 months of careful, anxious record-keeping by a woman who had known what she was part of and hadn't stopped it, but had also, quietly, ensured that it was documented. She served 18 months. She never returned to healthcare administration. She told the investigative journalist who interviewed her 2 years later that she thought about the loading dock most days and about the specific quality of Mara Elston standing in the rain and offering her a real choice. Dorian Marsh was arrested in Denver 4 days after Carver's custody, after Carver's attorney negotiated a partial cooperation arrangement that included Marsh's location and the full structure of the consulting network. Marsh had 5 clients beyond Hargrove across 4 states, all in the same pattern: a compromised administrator, a placed individual with a vulnerability, a consulting fee that appeared in no official vendor records. The investigation into those 5 facilities would take 3 years to fully resolve. Victor Delacroix was located in Portugal 6 weeks later. The international coordination involved 2 agencies and a legal process that would outlast the Hargrove investigation by years. His private firm was dissolved within a month of his location being confirmed. What happened after that was handled in venues that don't produce public records, which was appropriate, and also, Mara thought when Swick told her about it, very much in keeping with the world he'd come from. Elliot Carver cooperated fully and was processed through a military tribunal rather than civilian court, given the classification implications of his full role. The tribunal was not public. The outcome was. He was stripped of his commission, his security clearance, and his pension, and received a sentence that the Naval Intelligence Liaison described to Rafferty as proportionate to the damage, which was not a technical legal term, but was accurate. The margin notation in his handwriting, present at Carver/Delacroix briefing, March 14th. Status: unvetted. Recommend containment was entered into the federal record as evidence and thereafter into Mara's possession as a personal copy because Swick had arranged it, because she thought Mara should have it. Mara looked at the word containment for a long time when she received it. Then she folded the paper and put it in the back of a drawer, not because she wanted to forget it, but because she understood that the power a document has depends partly on how much space you give it in your daily life. She gave it a drawer, not a room. The conversation with Rafferty happened 3 weeks later in Denton Falls, at a diner 2 blocks from the hospital that she'd been going to for 8 months. He drove up from Colorado Springs, where he'd been coordinating the ongoing federal work, and they sat in a corner booth and ate eggs, and he laid out what he was proposing in the same direct, unembellished way he did everything. There was a joint task force being established under Naval Special Operations Command and the HHS Office of Inspector General, specifically focused on institutional healthcare corruption with a national security or intelligence-adjacent dimension. There were, as it turned out, more cases like Hargrove than the agencies had previously mapped. The methodology Carver and Delacroix had used, placing individuals with vulnerabilities, managing them through leverage, using institutional cover to protect larger operations, had been used elsewhere, probably more places than anyone currently knew. The task force needed people who understood both sides of the world it would be operating in, people who knew how intelligence networks function and how civilian institutional corruption develops, and how to walk into a hospital or a clinic or an administrative office and read it accurately in the time it takes to treat a wound. "It's not field work," Rafferty said. "You'd retain your nursing license. The clinical component would be part of the role. It's not a desk job." "But it's not an anonymous ER," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." She looked at her coffee. She thought about the 9 minutes in Bay 6, about the things she'd told Rafferty in the conference room corridor. "I wanted somewhere quiet. I wanted to do the work without the rest of it." It had been true when she said it. It was still true in the sense that the work, the actual work, hands and instruments and a clear problem and a patient who needed something she could provide, was the part she'd never stopped wanting. But the rest of it, the hierarchy, the command structure, the weight of institutional authority, she'd understood, somewhere in the last 3 weeks of reflection, that she'd left because she needed to leave, and that leaving had been correct, and that she'd been ready to come back for longer than she'd allowed herself to know. "I have conditions," she said. "I'd be concerned if you didn't," Rafferty said. "The classification review process for my deployment record. It has to move, and I have to be in the room when it does. I'm not carrying classified material as a vulnerability for another institution." "Agreed. The OIG's oversight committee is already and clinical authority. In any active medical situation I'm part of, clinical decisions are mine, not subject to review by someone with a rank, but no medical training. That's standard for the role. I want it in writing. You'll have it." She looked at him. He was drinking coffee and looking back at her with the same unhurried steadiness he'd had in every moment of the last 3 weeks. And she understood that what she was looking at was someone who was not going to tell her the job was easy, or that the complications were small, or that the world she was stepping back into had changed as much as she might want it to have changed. It hadn't. She knew that. The world she was stepping back into had the same structures and the same fracture points and the same capacity for people to use authority as a weapon against the people it was supposed to serve. It had Carvers in it, and Fitches, and systems that protected themselves at the expense of the people inside them. And it would always have those things because that's what institutions do when no one is paying close enough attention. But it also had Walters, and Coors, and Ronnies, 18 years old, who heard something wrong and said so in a room full of colleagues, and Deborahs who made phone calls to people they'd failed to protect the first time and tried again, and Marcus Tellers with accordion folders full of documentation they'd kept for 8 months in the precise awareness that it would matter eventually if someone would only act on it. She'd spent 18 months being convinced that the quiet was safety. It wasn't. The quiet was a cage with comfortable walls, and the person who'd built the cage had spent 18 months hoping she'd stay convinced. She wasn't convinced anymore. "When does it start?" she said. "We're targeting 60 days for full team assembly. Sooner if the ongoing cases accelerate." She nodded. "I'm going to finish out a month here," she said. "The ER needs a transition, and Ellis Drummond's case needs someone who knows the file. Take the time you need." She looked at the window. The diner faced east, and through the glass she could see the mountains in the morning light, actually visible today,
The sky for once without weather, the peaks sharp and white above the brown gold of the lower elevation. She'd looked at those mountains for 8 months from whatever window was available, and she'd been able to see them maybe a third of the time. The rest of the time they were there but hidden. She thought about something that had occurred to her in the 3 weeks since the night Carver was taken out of the building. Something she'd been working through slowly, the way you work through things that don't resolve neatly. She'd spent 12 years doing difficult work in difficult places, and she'd been good at it, and she'd known she was good at it, and she'd told herself when she left that she was done, that the work was done, that she'd given what she had to give, and the rest of her life could be something quieter. And then someone had looked at her hands in a hospital bay and seen the truth of what 12 years leaves in a person, and the truth was that she hadn't been done. She'd been resting. There was a difference, and it had taken 18 months inside someone else's trap to show her what it was. The things she'd done, in the field, in the deployment, in the 9-minute wound closure, and the 12 hours that followed, were not things that made her exceptional in the way that word usually works. She was not untouchable. She was not without error. She'd made the mistake of confusing quietness with safety, and she'd let herself be managed, and she'd walked out of a building with someone else's handprint on her face before she'd understood what she was walking back into. Those things were true, alongside the other things, alongside the steady hands and the read-the-room accuracy and the ability to hold still under impact and walk forward anyway. She was not a story about a woman who was always right and always strong and never got it wrong. She was a story about a woman who got it wrong for 18 months and then, on a Tuesday in the rain, closed a wound in 9 minutes and started getting it right again. The getting it right, it turned out, was not a moment. It was a practice. It was what you returned to, again and again, after every wrong turn and every miscalculation, and every time someone convinced you that the small life was the safe one. You returned to the work. You returned to the truth of what you were capable of. You stopped building walls around your own capabilities and started using them in the direction of something that mattered. She looked at the mountains, sharp and clear, and fully visible this morning, without anything in the way. "I'll be ready in 60 days, she said. Btch. On her last shift at Hargrove, which was 31 days after the arrest, which was the time it took to transition her cases and ensure the documentation was complete and say the things that needed to be said to the people who needed to hear them. She was in the ER at 7 a.m., the same as always. She was at the nursing station writing a chart when Deborah Stills came in and set a coffee on the counter beside her without saying anything. Mara looked at it, looked at Deborah. "From Core," Deborah said, "and Ronnie, and also from me, but I wanted to be honest about the sourcing." "Thank you," Mara said. "We're going to be short-staffed when you leave," Deborah said. "You were already short-staffed," Mara said. "You just didn't have the right framework for understanding it." Deborah looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "The new director is coming in Monday." I looked at her background. She was in emergency medicine for 14 years before she moved to administration. "That's a different kind of person than Btch," Mara said. "Considerably." Deborah paused. "I put in for the charge nursing coordinator role." Mara looked at her. "You're not surprised," Deborah said. "I'm pleased," Mara said. "That's different." Deborah looked at the station, at the shift notes, at the morning starting to move around them. "I spent a long time deciding things weren't my business. I'm going to spend less time doing that." "It'll cost you something," Mara said honestly. "That kind of decision usually does." "I know." Deborah looked at her directly. "I watched you walk out of this building with nothing and come back and take the whole thing apart in an afternoon. I think I can probably handle a coordinator application." Mara looked at her. Something in the look had a quality she wasn't used to allowing. Not soft, but not armored either. The specific quality of being seen and not moving away from it. "You'll be good at it," she said. She went back to the chart. The morning moved. The ER did what it does. It took in the city's emergencies and made decisions under incomplete information with available resources and imperfect knowledge and the constant background pressure of there being more need than capacity, which was not a crisis specific to Hargrove or to Denton Falls, but a condition of the work everywhere, always, and which meant the work was never done, and never without consequence, and never as clean as anyone wanted it to be. She did her part of it. One more time, in this building, in the way she knew how. At the end of the shift, she stopped by room 12, which had been reassigned 3 times since Ellis Drummond left. The current patient was a 16-year-old with a broken arm, nervous parents, and the look of someone who had been trying to be braver than they felt all morning. She checked the chart, asked how the pain was, got the real answer only after asking a second time, more directly. She adjusted the pain management order and explained what was happening with the arm in language that the 16-year-old could actually use, and the nervous parents visibly recalibrated, and the whole interaction took 11 minutes and left the room measurably different than she'd found it. She walked to the elevator, wrote it down, crossed the lobby. Walter was not there. He'd gone back to the Pacific Northwest 2 weeks ago, arm properly imaged and cleared, with a follow-up appointment scheduled and the particular manner of someone who has done what they came to do and has other places to be. He'd shaken her hand when he left, and she'd looked at his hand in hers and thought about what hands carry and what they remember and what they pass forward. She pushed through the front doors, the parking lot. Morning light, clear sky, the mountains fully visible in the bright, clean air of a November morning in Colorado. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her bag over her shoulder and her nursing badge, reinstated, formally, in writing, with an apology that had been required by Swick's office and delivered by the interim administrator, clipped to her jacket pocket. She thought about a concrete barrier in the rain and a mark on her face and 12 people who looked away. She thought about 9 minutes. She thought about what she'd understood in the accumulated hours of the last month, about silence and about choosing it, and about the difference between a quiet life and a diminished one. The truth about what happened to her, the real truth, underneath all the investigation and the arrest and the federal procedure, was not that a corrupt man had slapped her in a hospital corridor. It was that a corrupt system had spent 18 months trying to convince her that she was exactly as small as they'd positioned her to be, that the quiet was the whole life. That the capable woman with the classified record and the 12 years of difficult work behind her was best understood as a liability to be managed. She had not been small. She had been placed carefully inside a box and told the walls were hers. And a 73-year-old man with a bleeding arm had walked through the wrong entrance and found her hands and known, in under 9 minutes, what the box was actually holding. That's what she took with her. Not the arrest, not the commendation that Rafferty had told her was coming through official channels, the formal recognition of her service record's cleared status, and the role she'd played in the investigation. Not even the professional reinstatement, the apology in writing, the new title and the new role, and the 60 days. What she took was the understanding that capability does not require permission to exist, that the thing you know how to do, the real thing, the one built from years and repetition and error and every difficult place you've been, does not become smaller because someone needs it to be smaller. It waits. It stays exact and complete and available, and when the moment arrives where it's needed, it is still there. She had been there. She walked across the parking lot toward her car. The mountains were clear, the air was cold, her hands were steady. She had work to do.